lawyers have cooperated because of a scheduling problem with one of the defense attorneys. We're going to move into the rebuttal case of the state, except for the one witness that has a scheduling problem, and then I'm allowed the state to call the one witness that relates to that testimony. But, and I appreciate y'all working this out. I mean, I was inclined to just tell Mr. Knox, tough luck, but, you know, y'all have worked it out, and that's okay. I appreciate that, and that's what I would tell the jury, but it's not intended to, you know, change the order of presentation in the grand scheme of things. We'll have defense case, state rebuttal. So anybody have any question about that?
Just one thing, Your Honor. Mr. Fuchs and I had discussed, he's indicated if they don't get the material witness warrant for Kelsey Kennard, that they plan to play the former testimony. And you know, is saying kind of his reason for doing that is because it's part of rebuttal. I can't impeach him as effectively. What I would, and that is a smart tactic. However, he gave a very different version of the events to Investigator Bassio, and I think it would be fundamentally unfair to not put his prior inconsistent statements in front of him. Last time that was less than 10 minutes of testimony. I would ask if
I'm not quite following. Did you call Bassio last time?
Yes, sir, to impeach Kennard. Basically what happened was Kennard gave very, very few details, said the gun was hidden in the engine block of the vehicle, and very little else. Then came into court and offered a whole bunch of additional details, and I called Bassio back to impeach him and say none of that was offered initially.
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing is I'm going to have to hear some testimony about Kennard to determine whether he's unavailable or not. So I guess the state's going to give me some evidence on that before I make a determination that they can do that. But if they do that, it would appear to be appropriate. If you have significant impeachment of him, I frankly have forgotten that. But I think the way to do that to make it kind of line up appropriately would be to also provide Bassio's by video. Fuchs, you have a problem with that?
No, Your Honor, I'll have to go and pull the video. I can't remember off the top of my head whether or not we had any additional questions on that addition to the.
The Bassio you're talking about?
Yeah, I don't know whether there's any additional questions at that point because it was done differently. It was done during the state's case in chief with Kennard last time, and therefore Mr. Prince may have called Investigator Bassio and asked him these questions and asked him additional questions because I know he called him in this case as well, but I'm not sure that they can't.
If it's going to be a problem, I guess we'll call Bassio live, but it seemed to me that
I think we probably edited it
appropriate.
out.
I mean, the fairer way to do it would be to do them both by video than to have one live and one by video. But I mean, if you want to call Bassio, if you think we should call Bassio live, I'm good with that. I'm trying to balance it out.
I wasn't saying that, Your Honor. I was just saying that was just
Well, y'all look at that
about
and
the video.
see. Y'all look at that and see. But it seemed to me the fair way to do that would be to call Bassio by video also. We just have to see if we can do that. I assume he's available. But when you've made a determination that you are going to want to play Kennard's prior trial testimony, I am going to need to hear some testimony on what efforts have been made to get him here. I mean, I assume based upon the motion, I saw that there is a predicate for that, but I think we need to make a record of that.
Yes.
Further.
Yes.
Anything else?
No, Your Honor.
Anything else?
No, Your Honor.
All right. See y'all at 9 o'clock.
Thank you.
You'll have your witness in the court.
Yes.
is back in session.
Got a jury, please.
Remain standing for the jury.
Everybody have a seat. Good morning, folks. Thank you for being back here. Look, somebody just lost their pen over the side. Deputy, would you help them, please? I do appreciate y'all always being timely, reliable. One of the most reliable juries I've dealt with. Sometimes we have one or two that are time challenged, and we have to deal with that all the time. I appreciate y'all being very timely and responsible. Is Ms. Hawkins what we're going to present next?
Yes, sir.
All right. The next testimony is going to be presented to you by video. There is a transcript of it. As I've told you before, rely upon what's said on the video, not what's in the transcript, but we give you that transcript to help you follow along. Ms. Hawkins Clark has had medical problems and could not be here, and that's why we're presenting her prior testimony by video. So you should take it just like you would live testimonies. Everybody got a transcript? Looks like Mr. Brill's missing one. Are we missing one?
Yes.
Got one more? Here we go. Now he's got two. All right. And this is part of the defense case, correct, Mr. Prince?
Yes, sir.
All right, you may proceed with it. This was what we were having technical problems with yesterday, so hopefully it's working today.
If you face the clerk and be sworn, please. Ma'am, raise your right hand, be sworn, please.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony given in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes.
May proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ma'am, can you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell both your first and last name for the court reporter?
Okay. Good evening. My name is Tamika, T-A-M as in Mike, E-I-K-A. Last name Hawkins, H-A-W-K-I-N-S. I'm hyphenated Clark, C-L-A-R-K. And please pardon my voice. I have a big voice. I think I've utilized it too much. I have two kids that, because I'm handicapped.
That's enough.
Okay. So I'm sorry.
We're not here for a conversation. You'll ask you questions and you can answer them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. How do you know the defendant, Mr. Segura?
He's my daughter's father.
Okay. And your daughter, Janae, that's his daughter as well, correct?
Correct.
Was she a child that y'all had together during the course of his marriage and outside of his marriage?
That's correct.
Okay. At some point after Janae was born, did you obtain a child support judgment against Mr. Segura?
Yes, sir.
And how much was that for?
The monthly amount?
The total amount of arrearages owed at the time you got the judgment?
The total amount at that time was somewhere about $20,000, maybe upward of $1,000.
Okay. And in the process of collecting that judgment or attempting to collect that judgment, did you get Mr. Segura put in jail at some point?
I sure did, yes, sir.
Did you get his driver's license suspended at some point?
Yes, sir, I did.
Did you obtain a lien against any tax returns or tax refunds that he would receive?
Yes, sir.
Did you, in fact, obtain annual tax refunds that were supposed to have gone to him?
Yes, sir.
Okay. After you got that big child support arrearage judgment, did he come to court and deal with that? Or mediation, I guess. Did he come and deal with that?
Oh, during mediation? Yes, sir, he did.
Okay. And as a result of him going before the judge and dealing with it, did the judgment get reduced by about $10,000?
Yes, sir, he did.
Okay. After he got put in jail and got his license suspended and all that, did he make some efforts to comply with the monthly payment requirements?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But did he ever pay in full? Did he ever pay the full monthly amount regularly like he was supposed to?
Yes,
Let me
he did.
rephrase that.
Okay, thank you.
Aside from when his wages were garnished,
Okay.
did he ever voluntarily pay the full amount?
Voluntarily pay the full amount? Not always.
Okay. It was sporadic, but he was making efforts to pay.
Yes, sir.
Okay? And once he was making some efforts to pay, he never got put back in jail or anything like that, correct?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, in fairness, he also was able to avoid payment too, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did he work under the table at certain times?
Are you asking facts or my opinion?
Well, did you at some point find out through investigation that he was working under the table?
I, in fact, found out that he was working no longer in Florida.
So there's two different things. He was working out of state, correct?
Correct.
And that inhibited your ability to collect from him?
Correct. It inhibited my ability to collect the garnishment.
Mm-hmm. You would have to essentially chase him from state to state and try and get
Correct.
different child support judgments everywhere, right?
Correct.
And also, did he change employers from job to job so he was never with a single employer?
That's correct.
So realistically, your ability to collect from him outside of Florida was nil.
Yes.
Notwithstanding that, he did make efforts to pay you and buy things for Janae, correct?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
He kept in contact with Janae. Janae had her own phone. I want to make sure you all are hearing me correct. If there's any point, let me know. Janae had her own phone, which was monitored, so he would keep in contact with her. And when things came around, such as school, pageants, and pageants got pretty expensive, Mr. Segura, I came through with getting what was needed for that, as well as traveled and supported her.
Did he at every point exhibit resentment of any kind towards Janae?
I'm sorry, resentment?
Yeah.
No, sir.
Was it actually the opposite of that?
Did she resent him?
No. Was it did he exhibit the opposite of resentment? Did he have a positive relationship with Janae?
Very positive.
No further questions for the witness at this time.
He knew that Janae was his daughter, right?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
And isn't it true that on many different occasions he would constantly try and get you to reduce the amount so that way he could get better jobs in different locations and things like that?
I'm not understanding what you're asking.
He would come to you and ask you to reduce the amount of the child support that he owed you so he could get better jobs and get better paying jobs.
No, sir. And if I may elaborate, not asked to reduce. He asked me to have him taken off.
Okay. All right. So he asked you to take all of it away so he can get better paying jobs.
Not to get better paying jobs so that way I can get more. He felt that if I took him off of child support, then he would be able to pay me more and do more.
Okay. So he's trying to get you to do away with the child support then so he could...
And get rid of the middleman.
Okay. How much was he paying in child support to you?
I don't recall. I can give you an approximate.
That's fine.
540, 560, 580. It was in the 500s.
Okay, somewhere around $500?
Upward of 500.
Between $500 and $600, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. All right, no further questions?
Redirect. Just to clarify, even after the reduction of the arrearage, he still owed you nearly $9,000 as of 2010, right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. No further questions at this time.
All right, and juror, I have a question of this witness. All right, you can step down. Do we need to keep her further?
There you go.
You're free to go. Call your next witness.
Your Honor, the next defense witness is Michael Ford.
All right, come on up here, please, sir. Come on up here, please, sir. Face the clerk and be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Have a seat. Slide up to the rail, please, sir. Proceed, Mr. Prince.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. LaForte, can you please state and spell both your first and last name for the court reporter?
Yes, it's Michael F. LaForte, Michael, capital F, O-R-T-E.
Can you tell the jury what you do for a living now?
I'm a senior forensic consultant with Knox and Associates Forensic Consulting out of Jacksonville.
Okay. And what all does that entail?
We reconstruct, our main focus is shooting scenes, but we do crime scene reconstruction.
And can you tell us about some of the various components involved in crime scene reconstruction?
We review, we look at all the police reports, autopsy reports, crime scene photographs, any case materials that are involved in the case. We evaluate them and then see if we can come up to a conclusion.
Okay. And in order to be able to do that, have you had to go through any specialized education or training and gained any specialized experience?
Yes, I spent almost 30 years, 29 and a half years with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. From 74 until 1988, I was a patrol officer. In 1988, I transferred to the crime scene unit until my retirement in 2003. While I was in the crime scene unit, I processed a little over 9,500 crime scenes. Of that number, over 800 were death investigations, and of that number, over 500 were homicide scenes. Went to numerous courses, bloodstain pattern analysis, buried bodies, a number of different courses during that time period. When I retired in 2003, I had a consulting company where I did some training, put on courses around the Southeast and in Lima, Peru, taught bloodstain pattern analysis, crime scene reconstruction. 2009, I was hired back into law enforcement with the Duval County School Board Police until 2010, when I was hired by the Nassau County Sheriff's Office to start up their crime scene unit. There I wrote the policies and procedures for the crime scene unit. And in 2011, I was hired by Knox and Associates to come to work for them and to my current position.
And if you could, give us a little more detail about your training and experience as it pertains to blood spatter analysis specifically.
I attended multiple schools with the Sheriff's Office in bloodstain pattern analysis. After those schools, I trained the other crime scene people with the Sheriff's Office in bloodstain pattern analysis. It was ongoing training over those number of years in service courses.
And over your years in service, have you published or authored either parts of or in total papers, articles, or publications that were peer-reviewed?
After my retirement in 2003, I authored 3 books, 2 on crime scene procedures, processing crime scenes, collecting evidence, photography. My 3rd book was on photography, photographing examination quality photographs, which would be footwear, tire impressions, blood spatter, those kinds of things, fingerprints.
Okay. And have you ever testified in court as an expert?
I have.
Was that in various areas?
To the disciplines, would
Yes,
be blood stain, I've done blood stain pattern analysis testimony as well as crime scenes. I've testified in probably 7 or 8 jurisdictions here in Florida and also in Montgomery, Alabama.
Yes, sir. Your Honor, at this time I would tender the witness.
Any voir dire?
New York.
You may proceed.
Once you were retained to work on this case, did you have an opportunity to review the crime scene photographs provided by the state?
Yes.
And as you went through and looked at the various photos that were taken, were you able to conduct some blood spatter analysis as it relates specifically to the foyer area where victim Randy Peters' body was found?
Yes.
Okay. And have you selected some photos to aid you in explaining to the jury what your analysis was essentially?
Yes.
Is that represented in this PowerPoint presentation here?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I would request to move into evidence what's pre-marked for identification as defense 33 and as defense 33.
Any objection?
Make sure we're clear that 33 is the PowerPoint presentation.
Right.
Yeah, that was good.
All right, indeed. So we're admitting it, that means it go to the jury,
Yes,
or
sir.
is this demonstrative?
I was just going to admit it.
Your Honor, I'm gonna reserve till I see this in completion, because there may be portions that aren't appropriate to, go. The photographs certainly should go back to the jury, but, without seeing the entirety of the presentation, there may be something that's inappropriate to go back to the jury, so I'd like to reserve.
I'll reserve ruling on that
Thank you.
decision.
Yes, sir. To be clear, Mr. Knox, will this aid you in explaining your findings to the jury?
Yes.
At this point, Your Honor, I would request to be able to publish it, at least as a demonstrative aid.
You may.
And for record purposes, state is not having an objection to that, Your Honor.
When you first select a photograph in order to explain to the jury how you kind of progressed through this process, what was it that you were noting, and what is it that you wanted to be able to show to the jury with these pictures, and this one in particular?
This shows the position of Brandy Peters on the foyer floor, and the bloodstain patterns on the back of the door, which is the south wall, and then the wall at her feet, which is the west wall. It also shows transferred blood on the carpet just to her right and on the tile floor.
And can you explain to the jury, as you refer to these different areas, what blood transfer as opposed to blood spatter, cast off, all those different terms that you're going to use, what does all that mean?
Sure. On the west wall, the wall that's by her feet, you can see that, and I don't have a laser pointer to show you. Thanks. Thank you. This area right here, these lines would be transfer. These are consistent with a swipe mark. A swipe mark is a bloody object coming in contact with an area that doesn't have any blood, so it's transferring the blood to that surface. Those marks would be consistent, could be with a hand, could be from the feet. It's just some object is going back and forth across the wall, and there were several different directions. They were going left and right, and some were going left, up, and down. So that's significant as far as movement. With the overall bloodstain patterns, you want to look at it and see if you can come up with an event analysis, trying to sequence the events that took place in this area. And the amount of blood that's on the west wall would indicate that this area was most likely occurred first. There are heavier concentrations of the impact spatter on the back of the door. Those areas would have been after this, and then it rotates around to the east wall, which would be at her head. So it's most likely everything that's on the west wall there by her feet occurred prior to all of the other impact spatter.
And what is impact spatter as opposed to blood transfer?
Impact spatter is when an object comes in contact with a bloody surface and it disperses the blood. It projects it onto either a surface or the wall or on the floor.
Okay. And so, based on the blood spatter and the blood transfer marks that you see there, what, if anything else, were you able to gather from this photo?
One thing that's significant is the positioning of her body and the right arm. It would indicate that there was a prolonged struggle in this area, and she was moving to a certain point. The stains that are on the back of the door, these are also transfer stains. The patterns were difficult to determine. They could be associated with her head coming in contact with that surface. There were some feathering marks, which are consistent with hair. Could also be shoulders, it could be arms that are making those impressions. But the number of injuries to her head when she's at this position here, close to this door, she would probably been incapacitated to do any movements on her own. So if the position of her arm, her right arm is straight out, it would be indicative of her being dragged by the attackers to the position that she's into now.
Okay. Anything else with this slide?
No. Well, if you could go back one more. Go back on. The other thing is the height of the impact spatter here above the door. The documentation by law enforcement indicated the width of the foyer was approximately 8 feet 4 inches. The depth of it was 5 feet from here to here, approximately 5 feet. And from the photographs, it looked like the height of the ceiling was about 10 feet. So that's the area that we're discussing here. Okay.
At the top of the cast-off pattern right there.
The wall goes farther up, so the door is 6'8", so then you're talking about maybe another foot above that. So what this photograph is showing is approximately 8 feet.
Okay. How about with this next photo?
This is the impact spatter that's on the east wall. This is from her head. Some of this impact spatter could have occurred earlier on and could be consistent with her being in some upright position. A lot of the impact spatter, these larger stains here, are more consistent with her being on the ground and a larger object creating those stains.
And why do you say that?
It's the volume of blood that we're looking at here. To disperse that size of a stain, it would require something that's heavy. And there's another photograph that we'll get to later, but it'll show more in detail what's on the back of the door with regards to objects.
Okay. Next slide.
Yes. This photograph is autopsy photograph that depicts the trauma to her head. The autopsy report indicated there were over 17 blunt force injuries to her head. The ME determined that there was two impacts to this area. It also created fractures to the skull, and there was some brain tissue involved as well.
And how is that relevant to your spatter pattern analysis?
Well, it goes to looking at the injuries and trying to determine what could have inflicted these injuries, whether it could have been just one instrument or there were multiple objects.
Okay. And knowing what types of instruments are involved in causing the injuries is relevant to the type of cast-off pattern, spatter pattern we're going to see?
The type of impact spatter, yes. As I said earlier, the ME just determined in excess of 17 blunt force injuries to her head. What we're seeing here is different shapes. Some are a little bit curved, some are straight, and in different parts. Some are linear, some are, as in the previous photo, massive trauma.
Anything else from this photograph?
No. This shows another injury on the left side, and it's pretty destructive laceration there on the head, and this is different from the ones that were on the right side of the head, so it looks like a different object. This is an ovoid depression in the skull, ovoid, and basically round, but it's indicative of some type of heavy object that created this pattern. This depression also in the skull is indicative of some heavy object that created this type of injury, not something small and light. The medical examiner identified 3 different types of injuries here on the forehead as teardrop shaped, elongated, and triangular. Some of these injuries could have been made by a firearm. All of them possibly could have been, but the difference in the appearance would indicate that's possibly a couple of different weapons that would have made these injuries. And this is a curved injury that's on the top, near the hairline on the top of the head. And understanding the impacts or the number of blunt trauma injuries to the head and what they look like, and that you have depressions in the skull that are ovoid or rounded, would indicate that to create this type of spatter, these large drops here, it had to be some type of long, heavy object. Baseball bat, a 2x4, something that had some mass to it, and the ability for the person to swing it hard. To create that kind of cast off, that height, you would have to deliver a lot of force, and standing over somebody with a small light object is not going to disperse that kind of volume of blood. It's heavy, and this was created while the head was near the back of the door, and why I can say that is because blood actually traveled between this curtain on the front of the door, on the window, and went behind it and impacted on the front of the window. So there was enough force to send this blood 8-9 feet up. There's even blood up on the transom window here, large volume spatter. So again, it's to get it that high, to get that type of volume of blood, requires a lot of force and a large object to do that.
Can you explain a little bit about the physics of why a larger object would be required as opposed to a small object to cause the cast off to be, number one, in that volume, and number two, at that height?
Well, we're talking about gravity. I mean, gravity's trying to pull it down. For something that large to travel that high has to have a lot of energy behind it. When the spatter actually hits, there's enough energy in it that it actually it continues on. There's satellite spatter. If I had a close-up photograph, you could see little tiny satellites going straight up. So the force was enough when it hits the surface, it continues going up the wall. And I'm talking, maybe a half inch or 2 inch. There wasn't any scales on this, so I couldn't tell you the exact length of those satellite spatters. But that indicates the amount of force that was used to create that type of spatter.
When in the process of inflicting these wounds would the cast off have come off of whatever the object is?
Well, that's two different types. Impact spatter, when you have a surface that has a lot of blood on it and it impacts, and the object impacts, it disperses that blood, and the energy takes the blood out, but the energy then breaks this large clump of blood into smaller droplets. That's what the impact spatter is. That's what impacts and creates all that, the blood spatter on the walls. The blood is actually coming apart. With cast off is what you're asking about. Cast off comes off of the weapon. If I'm swinging a baseball bat, the cast off blood it has a cohesive property to it. It's sticky. The viscosity of blood is 4 to 5. The viscosity of water is 1. So when you put a drop of water, it runs everywhere. With blood, it sticks, and it has a cohesive factor to it. So if I'm swinging an object, the blood, until it breaks that cohesiveness from the surface, then it will fly off into space, and it'll hit whatever surface is around. So as you're swinging, the centrifugal force is bringing the blood out, and then it will hit whatever surface. But there were no photographs of the ceiling in the materials that we looked at, so I have no idea if there was any cast-off marks on the ceiling, which is where, if you're swinging like this, is where you would expect to find them on the walls. The problem with this type of scene is there was so much blood on the back of that door, it would be almost impossible to pick out cast-off patterns versus impact spatter patterns. You wouldn't be able to delineate. You may be able to tell something on the ceiling, but like I said, there were no photographs of those. With cast-off patterns, you're able, hopefully, to determine how many swings were involved. That wasn't done here.
Okay. Why is it that a greater volume of blood corresponds to a heavier object? Can you explain that to us?
Well, it has to do with leverage. If you're close up to the body when you're striking it, you're depending on if it would be a firearm or if it would be just a small club, you can't deliver that kind of energy to that surface. It's the same thing as if you're trying to remove a nut or bolt off of and it's tight and you can't get it off. If you use a small wrench, you can't do the leverage with it. But if you get a longer wrench, you can then apply more pressure, even pressure, and you can use to break it loose. So that's the same thing here. If you're farther away from the surface, you're able to swing and get much more force behind it when it strikes. Also, the weight is important. It's got to have some mass to it to create that type of spatter.
Is it even possible for a firearm to have caused the high volume impact spatter up at the top of the photograph?
No, because at this point, the victim's going to be on the ground.
How do we know that?
Well, the number of injuries to her head, I mean, she may have early on received several blunt force injuries to her head while she's upright, either kneeling, standing. But as those injuries are being inflicted, it's unlikely that she would have been able to stand there and take that. So, and the indications are based on, you've got the large area here, then it's going straight up, that she was most likely on the ground when those were being delivered.
So by the time the cast off spatter at the top of the photograph is being deposited on the wall, you're saying Ms. Peters is already on the ground?
Yes.
Anything else with this photograph?
No.
What are we looking at here?
This is showing the east side of the foyer floor. There's a lot of impact spatter that's radiating out towards the east wall here. And this is indicating that after she was moved from this position to her final position of rest here, indicates the location of her right arm that was straight out, but that there were blows struck in this position while she was on the ground. The blood is radiating out and away from her head and onto the wall. The other thing too is on the side where her feet were, all of this blood was smeared on the floor, and there's not a lot of impact spatter. When you hit an object, when you hit a body with an object, depending on how that object comes in contact, you're going to have forward spatter, which we see here, but you also can get back spatter, which is the blood coming back towards the direction of the forces originated. So blood can be dispersed 360 degrees, again, but it depends on how that object impacts the surface. But we don't see a lot of impact spatter over here, and that could indicate a couple of things, that there's an intermediary object. Now, her body was in this position here, her feet were down here, so that could explain why there wasn't any. There also could be an explanation of somebody standing at this location here as the beating continues, and they're blocking the spatter from being deposited on the floor. This is a more close view, but you see the blood that's been smeared around the floor. There was a drop of blood right here that's on top of the smeared blood, and there were some more drops of blood here. The photographs weren't adequate enough for me to tell direction. This one here appears to be pretty round, which would indicate it originated from above. It's dripping down, so it's a passive drip pattern. I can't tell what these are. These could be cast off. These could be impact spatters that came from the body and just deposited over there. But when we see this at a crime scene and you see blood, a different type of pattern that's on top of the smeared blood, it indicates that there could be another blood source. Somebody could be injured in here other than the victim and is depositing blood within the crime scene. This stain was not collected, so I don't know if it's the victim's blood or if it would have been somebody else's blood. The same way with these stains over here, they weren't collected, so with the source is unknown.
Thank you. Based on the volume and height of the cast-off, can you opine about roughly what the weight of the depositing instrument would have been?
I don't think I can find it as to the weight. Something that would be solid, fairly wide. A baseball bat is probably on the order of that. When you look at that type of injury that was to the left side of her head, that severe trauma, and then you've got the ovoid fractures to the depression in the skull, would be indicative of some type of instrument like that, like a baseball bat.
Combining the nature of the wounds that you discussed and particularly the cast-off pattern, is there any way that a firearm could have caused those injuries and deposited those high-volume, height cast-off?
Not the high ones. A firearm could have been used to inflict some of those injuries and to disperse some of that impact spatter that's on the lower parts of the walls and the door. That's possible. As far as the impact spatter that's high up on the door, up around 8-9 feet, no, there's no way that a firearm would have done that.
Thank you. I have no further questions for the witness.
Well,
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Ford, you work for Knox and Associates?
I do,
You work with Michael Knox.
I do.
Y'all are, I guess, a team, and I guess you probably have more employees than just the two of y'all, correct?
Well, we're the only two consultants. We have office staff.
Sure. Both you and Mr. Knox are being paid for this particular testimony by the defense, correct?
We're being paid by the state, yes, but I'm salaried. I get the same salary every month.
You mean you're being paid by the state? You weren't hired by the state attorney's office, were you?
No, state of Florida's paying
Through the defense?
through the defense, yes.
Okay, all right, just want to make sure that was clear. How much have you been paid so far?
How much has Knox and Associates been paid?
No, you.
Well, I get $2,500 a month.
Okay, so you get paid no matter what, the Knox Associates actually gets the main thing, and then you get dispersed for your salary?
Right, I get paid every month, my
Okay.
salary. Like
All
I
right.
said, it's salary, same salary.
All right, then do you know how much Knox and Associates would have paid for this, for your testimony as well as Michael Knox?
I don't.
Okay. Fair to say it's a pretty good chunk of change?
Well, I'm sure it's probably added up. I mean, we've been doing this for a while.
Sure, I understand. Now you say that all these injuries, it's possible that they could have been made by a firearm. All the injuries to Mrs. Peters could have been made by a firearm, correct?
No, I didn't say all of them. I said some of them could have been.
Okay. Which ones did you find that she couldn't have?
The massive injuries to the left side of the head, the round depression in her skull, the other one that we showed that was a pretty deep depression in the skull. Those wouldn't have been done by a revolver.
Okay. You're saying that that round object could not have been done by the butt of a .32 pistol
No,
being struck?
no, I don't
Why?
believe so.
Why?
The energy, the amount of force that would take to do that.
Okay. Amount of force to take to do that. You would agree with me the injuries that are inflicted on here, you're a homicide detective for a long time, correct?
No, crime scene detective.
Crime scene detective, okay.
Yes.
You've been to a lot of crime scenes and homicides, correct?
Many, hundreds,
Been involved in a lot of homicides.
over 500.
Been involved in situations with domestic violence.
Yes.
Homicides. You would agree with me that the infliction of these wounds were done in a manner that is both personal and very anger involved, would you not?
I would say there's a lot of overkill, yes.
Okay. And that's consistent with someone having a personal vendetta and a lot of anger against somebody, correct?
Possible, yes.
Okay. You would agree with me that not everybody can use an object in the same manner. Different persons can use it with more force than others.
Possible.
Okay. Would you agree that I can probably use something that I'm swinging or using as a club with more force than Ms. Dugan?
Probably.
Okay. Fair enough, she's probably in better shape than I am. But regardless, you would also agree, of course, that, say for instance, Peyton Manning can throw a football farther than I can, right?
Yes, farther than me.
Sure. So the amount of force that is done is certainly conditioned upon the person that's exerting the force, is it not?
Well, there's other things to look at, and that would be the impact spatter itself.
Okay, we'll get to the impact spatter itself in a second, but you would agree with me that the object that is being used and the amount of force that's being used behind that object is in fact indicative and really controlled by the person that is exuding the force.
Could be,
Could be?
yes.
How could it not be?
It depends on the person that's doing it, but
Right,
possible.
right. How could it not be? How could the person that's swinging an object and impacting with another object not be the one that controls and the amount of force that they use not be controlling of the amount of that force?
I don't know. I mean, there's other variables I would think.
Like what?
Their health, their condition, if they're using left hand versus right hand, there are a number of instances that you could come up with that probably, would dictate that there's variables. There's variables in everything.
Sure, but their health, their conditioning, the left and the right hand is controlled by the person exerting the force, is it not?
At the time it's being done, correct.
Correct, right. So the person that's exerting the force is the one that actually is the one that's in control of how much force is being used.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. So and again, we would agree that different persons of different build and different strengths can exert force a lot more than other persons, can they not?
Possible, yes.
Possible?
Possible, yes.
Okay, how is it not possible?
Well, nothing's 100%, but given your scenario, yes, it's possible.
Okay. And someone like Mr. Segura that's used to dealing with metals, who's a very strong individual, built very large individual, is in very good shape, is certainly able to exert a great deal of force in using an object, is he not?
Probably.
Okay. And now, let's talk about the blood spatter we're talking about here. You've heard the term every action has an equal and opposite reaction, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So essentially what that means is the amount of force that you utilize is conditioned to the amount of force that's coming off of an object, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if you're swinging an object with an extreme amount of force and you're coming back, it's going to go a lot farther than it would if you're swinging it in a less strengthened mode, correct?
Well, you're describing two different things now. You're describing impact spatter, and now you're coming back. That's cast off. So that's two different things.
Oh, correct. Okay. So you're saying that all of that blood is in fact impact spatter and not cast off?
Yes.
Okay. How can you tell the difference?
Cast off has to do, the patterns from cast off are consistent with the type of object that's being used. If you have, let's say, a knife, a butcher knife, and you're stabbing somebody, as you're bringing it back, the cast off pattern is going to be linear. Okay, it's going to be just a single line basically going straight up or coming down. When you're using a larger object, like a baseball bat, the cast off that would come off of that would be the width of the baseball bat. So if you have the cast off patterns that you can identify, a lot of times the cast off pattern will lead you to the type of weapon that's being used. And like I said, on the back of that door, on that south wall, there was so much impact spatter, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to pick out the impact, the separate impact spatter patterns, or I'm sorry, the cast-off patterns. So that's the difference. Impact spatter, when you hit the surface, the blood radiates out. It expands. The farther away you are, the bigger the cone. So, of course, the closer you are, the narrower the cone. But that's the difference between the two.
Okay. And then in this particular case, as you just said, the door itself, you can't really tell which spatter it is, whether it's cast off or in fact impact spatter, correct?
The size of those large things that we're talking about at the top of the door, those are consistent with impact. And again, that would be from the initial impacts.
Okay.
They're not cast off.
All right. You made a determination as to where the certain injuries occurred, where she was lying down because she would have been lying down because of the injuries, correct?
Yes.
Okay. How were you able to determine which injuries occurred when?
I can't.
Okay. So you don't know when each injury occurred, do you?
No, I don't know when each injury occurred. I know that where she likely, based on the volume of blood that's on the west wall versus what's on the south and east walls, that spatter, those transfer patterns occurred prior to the massive blood loss.
Okay. So there is a possibility that the impact for one of those injuries was while she was standing up, correct?
No, I don't believe so.
That's not possible?
Given those, no, I don't believe so.
Okay. Why?
Well, if you want to go back to it, I can show you, but there was a large volume of blood that was lower down the door, maybe 2.5, 3 feet. Could she have been upright? Could she have been kneeling? I don't think so even at that. She'd have been lower. She'd have to be lower than that to get it at that position. Then you have the other large volume that's higher up on the wall.
But she had more than one massive injury to her head. Isn't it entirely feasible that she's standing upright, one of those massive injuries hit her, knocks her down, and then the rest of the massive injuries occur while she's on the ground?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, fair enough. That's your opinion, correct?
That's my opinion.
You would agree with me, a medical examiner can probably talk a little bit more about the sequence of events or not, as far as the injuries, right?
I don't think they can sequence the events when they occurred.
Okay, no more than you can.
Again, it's the totality of the evidence. It's basing it not only on the injuries, but it's also on the impact spatter that's on the walls.
Okay. And you're saying that is all much more consistent with a baseball bat?
A baseball bat is an example.
Or type of.
It's type of something that has a large mass and that has some weight to it.
Okay, so you're looking for something that's got large mass and weight to it.
Yes,
Okay. Baseball bat's made of wood usually, sometimes they're metal.
correct,
Okay. Gun is made of metal.
correct.
Okay. So you're talking about really as far as mass goes, they're kind of the same. They're just one's longer than the other. Weight-wise, they're going to be about the same. Baseball bats are 28 ounces, 26 ounces, something along those lines. Firearms are roughly going to be the same weight, are they not?
I've never weighed them, but I would think they may be close, depending on what type of you're talking about. But the other thing is, somebody holding a revolver or a pistol versus standing back, the dynamics of hitting somebody close up, even if you're exerting a lot of pressure, you're blocking some of that blood. Okay, your hand is here. The baseball bat or whatever the large object would be, you would be back away from it, and you're being able to apply more power to that surface and dispelling that blood. I think, given what you're asking, it's more likely that it's a larger object versus all of it coming from a firearm.
Okay. Well, you would agree somebody who's swinging a firearm and they're using their arms, you're talking about, well, in my case, you're talking about 3 feet armed or something like that and down. There's pretty good range there, is there not?
Yeah,
Okay.
but not as much as you could get from standing back and wielding a larger object.
Sure. You have a baseball bat, you extend it another, what are they? They're normally about 34 inches, I think they are, is what baseball bats are, roughly 32, 34 inches. So
Right.
almost another 3 feet.
Right, with a 10-foot ceiling, you've got more than enough room to stand up and swing that 180-degree arc and come on down.
Okay, fair enough. But you would also agree with me that you could also do it with the 4-foot or 3-foot arc with your arm if you're angry in a personal manner.
Well, the thing is you're going to have to be down on your hands and knees if the person's down there.
Sure.
It's not something, with a baseball bat, you're standing up and you're putting your full weight behind it. With a firearm, you're going to be on your knees and you can't deliver the same amount of energy, I don't believe.
No further questions.
Redirect.
Mr. Fuchs was asking you briefly about left-handedness versus right-handedness. No determination could have been made regarding which hand an individual used to inflict wounds in this case, is that correct?
That's correct.
And why is that?
Well, it's next to impossible to figure out if you're left or right-handed based solely on the impact spatter. You'd have to have probably more information. And given the amount of spatter that was on those walls, there would be no way to say left or right-handed.
Okay, and that's because a person's body position and how they're swinging an object can change, and it would impact the wall in exactly the same way, regardless of which hand it was being swung with.
Correct. And obviously, with the spatter patterns that are on 3 different walls, and it's evident that her body had moved, changed positions. So yeah, it wasn't static. There was always movement involved.
Okay. Mr. Fuchs asked you about an individual's physical abilities and strength and all that. Even a good person, a person in good health and in good shape and of, stronger than average, would a person be able with a .32 caliber revolver to exert the amount of force necessary to cause cast-off in that volume at that height?
Just want to correct, it would be impact spatter, and no.
Okay. How, if at all, would it impact an assailant's ability to exert force if within, say, 90 days of the incident, if they had undergone invasive surgery with their abdominal wall being sliced 9 inches?
Your Honor, I'm Jack, this is speculation.
I would think it would have some effect to be able to not only swing, but to get into position that would be necessary.
Okay. And even if the cast-off is coming off the object at the top of the motion and the person is standing, is the volume and height of the cast-off in any way consistent with it coming off of a firearm?
No.
Could it possibly have come off of a firearm, or given the volume and height, is that impossible?
It's possible. With cast-off, basically all you can tell is where the object was in space when the blood left the surface. And if it's a linear object, if it's a linear line, you might be able to determine that. If it's a wider line, cast-off pattern, it may be indicative, but it would just depend on the cast-off pattern and what it looks like. So again,
Okay.
cast-off it just depends on what the impact angle is and where that comes back to in space, and that would tell you where it was when it came off the weapon.
Okay. Given the totality of the blood spatter evidence we have here, both with the impact spatter, the blood transfer patterns, and the cast-off, can we say definitively that a .32 revolver did not cause the pattern the pattern that you observed and testified about here?
It did not create the large volume patterns that were on the top of the door in the middle. Absolutely did not do that.
Thank you. No further questions.
Did the juror have a question of this witness? All right, you step in.
Your Honor, this time, pursuant to stipulation before I close this case, the defense would move into evidence composite exhibit 3, which are documents relating to Mr. Villalobos.
Sir?
Correct, Mr. Pugh?
It is, Your Honor. They were asked about during this testimony, and I anticipate you'll hear about it anyway.
So admit defense exhibit 3, was it?
Yes, sir. 3,
Right.
A, B, and C.
And was what was shown to the jury the entirety of the PowerPoint?
For Mr. LaFleur, yes, sir.
There's more on that document,
No, sir, that's it.
right? So does the state have any objection
No,
to
the
it?
state does not have any objection, Your Honor. I did
Okay.
note on the junk drive, there are 3 or 4 different things in there that had to do with his notes. I want to make sure that we burn the PowerPoint itself only onto a disk for them to take back.
All right,
We'll need that taken care of.
all right, we need to make sure, but it's admitted with that understanding?
Yes, sir.
All right, so let's go sidebar. All right, so that will conclude the defense case with the exception of one witness. They had one witness that they had a scheduling problem with that's going to have to testify Monday morning. So the next thing we're going to do is move into the stage rebuttal evidence. I don't think it's going to be confusing, but make sure you understand what we're doing. We're going to move into the rebuttal of what the defense has presented so far. And then Monday morning, they have one other reconstruction expert that they wish to call, the defense wish to call, and the state's going to reserve their reconstruction expert to testify after that witness. So that's going to be the sequence of events. I think it'll be fairly clear-cut, but I want to make sure you understand. The lawyers been working together and appreciate that they're cooperating, make sure that we can keep things flowing, even though we've had a few scheduling issues that we need to deal with. So with that, let's take 15 minutes and we'll start into the stage rebuttal case.
And Your Honor, can we remain for just a moment?
Yep,
Thank you.
let the jury step back. be seated, Mr. Fuchs.
Your Honor, just to let you know, the procedural, Mr. Prince and I discussed the witnesses. Mr. Yao is, going to be testifying in rebuttal as to both, Mr. Laporte and Mr. Knox's testimony. Rather than call him today and trying to call him back again after Knox, we both agreed that he just wait till Monday to do the rebuttal.
Oh, yeah, that would make sense.
Yes, sir. Just want
Is
to.
that it?
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll take 15 minutes.
Thank you.
be seated, please. May I call your first rebuttal witness, Mr. Fuchs or Ms. Dugan?
State calls Major Annie Johnson.
Okay.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Have a seat, please.
Good morning, Major Johnson. Will you introduce yourself to our jury and spell your name for our court reporter, please?
Sure. My name's Anne Marie Johnson, and that's spelled ANNE-MARIE. Last name spelled JOHNSON.
Okay. Did you go by Annie?
I do.
Okay. And what is your, I called you a major. Where do you work?
I work at the Tallahassee Police Department. I'm currently major over the Patrol Bureau, Northern Sector.
And how long have you been with Tallahassee Police Department?
I've been with Tallahassee Police Department for 18 years and in law enforcement for a total of 20.
Okay. Were you with Tallahassee Police Department back in November of 2010?
I was.
And what was your assignment at that time?
I was an investigator with the Homicide Violent Crimes Unit.
Okay. And I guess throughout your 20 years, have you kind of been in pretty much every different unit at TPD at some point?
Pretty much through everyone within the Investigations Bureau, yes.
Okay. All right. So in November of 2010, you said you were an investigator in the Homicide Violent Crimes Unit. What was your role in this case?
I assisted Investigator Mark Lewis. I was one of the assisting investigators.
Okay. Were you the only woman with the last name of Johnson who was an investigator on this case?
Yes.
Okay. Was there a woman named Joanna Johnson who was ever working on this case?
No.
All right. So if there was a woman whose last name was Johnson on the case, it would be you.
That's correct.
All right. And your last name was Johnson back in 2010 as well?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right, so I guess we would be a little familiar with you already because we saw you in the November 30th interview with the defendant, right? His second interview?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, you were the one saying, I know you have a cell phone. That was you?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, when the defendant was arrested in Minnesota in 2011, so fast forward about a year from that interview, did you ever call him on the phone when he was in Minnesota?
No, ma'am.
Either before or after he was arrested? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Did you call him in Minnesota before or after he was arrested?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did he ever tell you at any time, I'm talking before arrest, during the investigation, after arrest, did he ever tell you at any time that he went to Brandy Peters' house on November 19th for any time or at any time or for any reason?
No, he did not.
So he never told you that he was at Brandy Peters' house that day?
No.
That's all I have.
Ron?
You say Mr. Segura never told you that he was at Brandy Peters' house on November 19th, correct?
That's correct.
You wouldn't have any idea what other investigators or officers he talked to, correct?
To my recollection, there was only a handful of us that he spoke to that worked together on the case.
I'm sorry?
That worked together on the case. There was only a few of us that he would have spoken to.
All of the homicide investigators in that division at TPD were assisting on this case, correct?
Correct.
And so that would have included the case agent, Mark Lewis, correct?
That's correct.
And then also Mr. Basio, now Lieutenant Basio,
That's correct.
and yourself.
Yes.
What other investigators were involved, homicide investigators?
Investigator Mr. Brava at the time, it's Lieutenant Wilder now. Investigator Mark Lewis. Now Lieutenant Mike Selesky, who was a sergeant over our unit at the time, and then there were several other investigators that were assigned various tasks throughout the investigation, running down legal process, getting those signed, doing some other interviews of other individuals, family members, that sort of thing.
Sergeant Corbett too, in technical ops?
Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot him.
So a lot of people involved,
Yes.
especially relative to any other case. It's not normal for every single homicide investigator plus tech ops to all be involved in the same case, right?
Not necessarily, but yes, it was a different case.
Right. And in terms of how each investigator involved was communicating with each other. Do you agree that it would be fair to say the left hand wasn't always talking to the right in this case?
Yes, there were a lot of moving parts and a lot of things going on at the same time. That's correct.
Okay, so different people were focused on different scenes and different evidence, correct?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that you were involved in was obtaining a warrant for a bug, I guess is the best way I can phrase it, that was ultimately placed in or on Mr. Segura's vehicle, right?
Yes.
And that would have been in the year that you guys were investigating before you arrested him, correct?
Yes.
And so there was an extended period of time, was it 10 months, something like that, where you had an operational listening device in his vehicle and never got a single piece of incriminating evidence from that entire time, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
Redirect.
Yes, sir. That would just mean that he never, from what you heard in his car, he never admitted to anyone in his car that he committed these crimes.
That's correct.
Okay. Speaking of the bug, did you make a call to Mr. Segura one time before he ever went to Minnesota while he was here in Tallahassee on his phone while there was a wire in his car?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Tell us about that phone call.
Well, earlier in the investigation, we had let Mr. Segura know that once we received the DNA results with regards to paternity for Javante, that we would let him know what the results were. So I made that call with that purpose, and to let him know that that we had gotten the results back from the DNA, and to see if I could elicit a response to what that meant to him, knowing about Javante actually being his biological son.
So you wanted to inform him that he was actually his son and then say something to see how he would react to you.
Correct.
Okay. So did you tell him on that phone call that you got the DNA results back and Javante was his son?
I did.
And how did he react to you?
If I remember correctly, he just stayed quiet with regards to that portion of it.
Okay. And then what did you say?
I said, so how does it feel to know that you killed your biological son?
And what did he say?
He said something to the effect of, what evidence do you have to prove that?
And then did he hang up on you at that point?
Yes.
Fair to say, if he had ever told anyone, any of the investigators, that he was actually at this victim's house the day that the murders happened, that's something that you would know?
Yes.
Okay. That would have been a big deal in the investigation to you all, right?
Yes.
For the person that you're suspecting who committed this crime to now admit that he was at her house that day.
Correct.
That would have been a change, a huge change from what he said in his November 20th and November 30th interviews, right?
Correct.
You would have seen a report about that.
Yes.
Excuse me. You would have seen a report about that.
Yes.
You guys would have discussed that.
Correct.
Even though there were a couple of investigators working on this case, y'all were regularly discussing this case all the time together.
Yes.
Okay. And have you ever heard of him ever admitting to anyone that he was at Granny Peters' house the day of these murders at any time for any reason?
No.
That's all.
Any juror have a question of this witness? All right, if not, you may step down. Call your next witness.
So he calls April Dudrava.
is Lieutenant Debrava Wilder.
Lieutenant, I think you previously told us that on November 20th, the day these bodies were discovered, your role there at 908 Saddle Creek Run was kind of overseeing the crime scene.
That's correct.
Okay. Did your team go through the trash cans in Brandy Peters' home that day?
On that day, we looked at the top, we didn't, it was more for preservation. So we did more of dealing with the bodies and collecting and going through the crime scene. So we looked at the tops. We didn't dump them out that day. Teams that went back other days then did a thorough cleaning of the entire house.
Okay, so that day you looked at the top of the trash cans to see if anything of obvious evidentiary value was in the trash cans.
That's correct.
On that day, did y'all see a condom or a condom wrapper on top of any of those trash cans?
No, we did not.
Okay. In the following days, when I guess an even more intensive processing was done and you guys dumped the trash cans, was a condom or a condom wrapper found in those trash cans?
I was never notified that a condom wrapper was found in the trash cans. On the second and subsequent days that went out there, there was another team that went out there, but I was still in charge of all the evidence that was collected as far as sending it to FDLE, so anything of value that was discovered was identified to me, and then I would determine whether it needed to go to for processing or not.
And if a condom or a condom wrapper was found in those trash cans, could that be considered maybe important to the case?
Right, it would indicate somebody else being there at the scene.
So in other words, Brandy Peters might have had sex the day that this happened. Y'all could send it to FDLE to be tested for DNA, maybe get some more information about what happened that day, who was over there.
Correct.
So that would have been something that you or any member of your team would have informed you of as the sergeant overseeing everything.
Right, I was an investigator overseeing that, but yes.
I apologize, as the investigator overseeing it. And were you ever notified that either a condom or a condom wrapper was found the day of November 20th or any day after?
No.
Did your team walk around the entire property of Miss Peters' home and yard?
Yes.
Okay.
We did that day and additional days.
Okay. Was her backyard dug up? Were there any holes in it?
No.
Okay. You weren't involved in you weren't in the room for any of the interviews of Mr. Segura, right?
Correct.
Okay. And you might not have even ever talked to him, I don't know, but did he ever tell you, though, that he was at Miss Peters' house the day of these murders on November 19th?
No, I never spoke to him.
Okay, that's all.
This may seem a silly question, but y'all didn't send like a snake camera down the plumbing or have the septic tank pumped for evidence, correct?
Correct.
And so if a condom or condom wrapper were flushed, that's not evidence that would be available to you, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
Raise your hand.
No, sir.
Hey, Jerry, I have a question of this one. All right, if not, you can step down. We need to keep her any further.
No, sir.
All right.
Oh, actually, she'll remain under the rule, but she
All right,
can
remain under the
go
rule.
out about her business.
Call you next one.
The state calls Monica Peters.
You were previously sworn?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Peters, have a seat. You remain under oath. State your name for the record, please.
Monica Peters,
All right, you may proceed.
Ms. Peters, what was Brandy Peters' date of birth?
February the 14th, 1983.
February 14th, 83?
1983.
Okay. So if she was born in 83, then she would have turned 17 years old, right? In February of 2000?
Yes.
So in the year 2000, she would have been 17 years old?
Yes.
Did she have a driver's license when she was 17 years old?
No, ma'am. She
When did
she
when
got her
did she-
driver's license when she was 20 years old.
Okay. So she would not have gotten a driver's license until then the year 2003 when she was 20 years old.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. When did she get her first car that she was able to drive?
Right in 2006.
Okay, so she would have been 23 then in 2006?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So 17 in the year 2000, didn't get a driver's license till she was 20, 3 years later, didn't have a car that she had access to drive until 2006, 3 years after that.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, when she was 23. All right, you told us in your last testimony last week that, you know, you guys were obviously sisters and y'all were sisters who talked and saw each other on a daily basis, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Did Brandy ever deal or transport drugs?
No, ma'am.
Did she ever disappear for days at a time for out-of-town trips?
No, ma'am.
Had she ever been to Texas?
No, ma'am.
Had she ever even been, I mean, was she somebody who had been very many places at all outside of Tallahassee and North Florida?
No, ma'am.
So she was not somebody who was going out of town often?
No, and definitely not at 16, 17. She was living in my mom's house. My mom was very strict. She was not one of those people that she'd never let us out her eyesight, and that's facts.
Okay.
Everybody that knows my mom knows that she was very, very strict on us. And at 16, 17, she wouldn't have not left the house for days at a time.
All right, so for Brandy's whole life, you never knew her to go out of town for days at a time, but especially in the year 2000, when she's 17 years old, she's at your mom's house. She's not going out of town anywhere, even for one day.
No, ma'am.
All right. Did Brandy have any money?
No, ma'am.
Did she have some flashy lifestyle?
No, she didn't.
Did she receive food stamps from the government?
Yes, she did.
You told us last time you testified that her car that was in the driveway was a car that was actually broken down that week, and it was an older car that she borrowed from your mother.
Yes,
Did Brandy, her whole life, from the time she was first got a car, I guess in 2006 you said, to the time that she died in 2010, did she ever have a car that was reliable enough to make it to Texas?
No, ma'am.
Before she qualified for her house on Saddle Creek Run, which you told us was Section 8 housing, before that, where did she live before that?
She lived in Holton Street Projects.
Okay.
At the top of Holton Street Projects, right
And
off of Holton Street.
And you said
that
it's
was
a housing project?
It was hub housing.
Okay, so it was a HUD housing project
Yes,
on Holton
ma'am.
Street? All right, I'm sorry for talking over you.
Oh, no, you're fine.
And was that an apartment?
Yes, it was an apartment.
Before her Holton Street apartment and the housing project, before that, was she kind of just staying family member to family member?
Before that, she lived it with me. Well, she lived it with my mama for a little while. And before she lived it with my mama, she lived it with me on Laura Lee Road in Appalachia Ridge. And before then, she lived it with me in Appalachia Ridge on, I think that was Cobra Street. Me and my kid's daddy, both of those houses, she lived with us.
Okay. On November 20th, the day that the bodies were discovered, what did police tell you and the rest of your family there at the scene about what they found inside the house?
Well, when they first got there, they didn't tell us anything. They just made everybody get back. So they told us that to get back. The first lady, she just told me to get the kids out of the car or whatever. Because I remember.
This is your kids. These are your
told
kids.
me to get my kids out of the car because the black car that was parked in that yard, that was my car that was parked in front of the yard because I was the first one to get there besides my brother pulled up secondly. The police, I don't think I remember that day where she told me to remove the kids from the car, to stand back just in case anybody was in the house. And so we all got back, and then another officer arrived on the scene. And after that officer arrived, I remember them walking around the house or whatever and clearing around the outside of the house out. And then when they came back, another officer came, and I remember the officer taking her stick, breaking the window out.
Okay, let me ask you a more specific question, okay? Mm-hmm. Did officers tell you at some point that Brandy, and I guess at first, 2 children were found in the home?
Yes, but that wasn't right away.
Okay.
They had brought out to the crime scene van, and me and
My mom, them, that they was all standing down there. My mom was on the inside of it. I remember one of the officers coming down there and saying that, asking us who all we thought that was in the house. And we told her that my sister Brandy, her two twin girls, Tamaya and Tanaya and Javante, and they told us that they only seen my sister and the two twin girls. They did not tell us where they was located at. And my mama said, well, my grandson should have been in that house. And he said, well, unfortunately, we haven't seen a child in the house.
Did they eventually later tell you that they did find a third child in the house?
I think that was way later, after the crime scene hadn't came and they was going through the house or whatever, and realized that he was on the bottom,
Right.
on the bottom of the girls or whatever. I don't know, but it wasn't.
But you know that since this has happened, I'm talking about that day.
Oh, that day, yeah.
Right.
That day. No.
My question for you is, that day on November 20th, did y'all have any knowledge from police about where these children were found in the home?
No, ma'am.
Did they tell you how they died?
No, ma'am.
Did you know anything besides the fact that the children and Brandy were deceased and they were inside that home?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So now, from being in trial, watching the evidence, you know that they couldn't find Javante because he was on the bottom.
Yes, ma'am.
But that day, you had no knowledge of where they were found.
No, ma'am. They did not tell us that. They just told us that they were sorry to inform us that everybody that was in the house was deceased.
Okay. That's all.
Ma'am, you said to your knowledge, Brandy wasn't involved in drug dealing, correct?
Of course, yes.
And your testimony is that wasn't part of her lifestyle,
No, it wasn't.
and she didn't associate with folks who lived that lifestyle, at least not closely, correct?
I can't tell you that she didn't. I wouldn't sit on stand and tell you that she didn't associate with people that just because you associate yourself with somebody or know somebody that does it, that doesn't mean you do it.
She was closely associated with Kenny Green, right?
But she knew Kenny Green. She wasn't associated with him. They wasn't together at the time that all of this occurred, and I know that for facts.
He was her boyfriend
No,
for a
he
while
wasn't.
there, and everybody believed that Javante was his son for some period of time. Isn't that true?
I don't know about that.
Okay. Kenny Green was actually in custody at the same time at the same place that Carlos Sanchez was, over at Federal Detention
He
Center. right?
was.
So your testimony to Ms. Dugan was that law enforcement didn't tell you all that they only initially found 2 kids in the bathtub. Is that right?
They didn't tell us they found him in the bathtub.
Okay. And perhaps you can answer this. How would anybody know that law enforcement hadn't been able to initially find the third child victim unless that information was widely disseminated? How would anybody know that on the 20th if that information wasn't widely disseminated by law enforcement?
Well, I don't. Then maybe that was after they found out, because when we was on the scene, and I know that for facts. When we was there as a family, everybody showed up. They did not tell us that kids was found in no bathtub.
Okay. Your previous testimony was that everything was a blur that day, correct?
No, I told you I was emotionally. I could have been emotionally. I didn't tell you everything was a blur. I said I could have been emotionally. I said it could have been my emotions going everywhere when I wrote that report. I didn't say everything was a blur.
Okay.
Because I remember that scene today, 9 years ago, like it was today.
So you
Nothing
weren't
changed.
you weren't so emotionally distraught that you would have been saying things that were untrue.
I'm not gonna say nothing that is not untrue. I'm gonna sit here and I'm gonna tell the truth.
Okay. And that's why you told Investigator Jernigan on the day that the bodies were found.
I would object to improper impeachment.
Back to the earlier question, I don't think you answered this question. If law enforcement hadn't disseminated the information
This was asked and answered.
Don't answer the question till I hear the question, Mr. Peterson. Ask your question.
Yes, sir. Let me back up and ask the predicate first. Law enforcement was on scene for quite a while on the 20th, correct? The day
Sure
the bodies were
was,
found?
yes.
And were canvassing the neighborhood, talking to people, right?
Yes, they was.
Okay. So you're not aware of what every officer on scene was doing and what they were telling everybody, correct?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. And you only know about what they told you, is that right?
I only know what they came and told me and my family.
Okay. So do you agree that it would be impossible for anybody to know that law enforcement couldn't initially find the third child victim unless law enforcement had spread that information around.
I would object to speculation.
But I think it assumes facts, not evidence. She hasn't said that they didn't tell her they were missing one child. She said she heard that.
Let me clarify that then. Did law enforcement tell you that they were unable to find the third child victim?
Yes, they did tell us that.
Okay. And later on that same day, you found out that they found the third child victim, Javante, underneath his sisters, correct?
Well, yeah, they told us that the third child was in the house after they cleared the crime, after they went in and cleared the crime scene, but that was later that day. That wasn't like when we was out there, because after the crime scene got there and they told us that they was gonna clear the house out and bring out all the bodies, they asked us to leave. So me and my mama left. If I could recall, my brother stayed there. Tamaya and Tanaya daddy, Tony, he stayed there. He wouldn't leave. So it was a few family members that stayed there. But I know that day, me, my mama, and my stepdaddy, all of us left because they asked us, they wanted us to leave just so they can remove the bodies from the house.
So that's a yes. On the 20th, at some point, law enforcement told you that the third child victim, Javante, was discovered underneath
but we still did not know how they was how they was died, where they were located at. They didn't tell us anything about where they was located at.
Your testimony was that they didn't tell you he was located under his sisters? Your testimony
Well,
is they
that
didn't
was
tell you
later on. That was later, but that wasn't at the time of the crime scene. They didn't disclose that information when we was there. We didn't talk to anybody. I know for a fact that none of my sisters and brothers and none of us went to nobody's house. We didn't talk to nobody that day but the law enforcement officer.
So your testimony is that law enforcement told you Javante was found and nobody asked where he was found?
We no.
Okay.
For the whole while of this case, they asked us, did we want to know what happened to them or what was the cause of death, and we said no, and I know those are facts. Even
I
the law
understand.
enforcement complied to that one.
No further questions.
Losing these little children in your family, y'all didn't even want to know how they died.
No, we didn't.
Even when law enforcement asked, you didn't even want to know.
No, ma'am.
And you're telling us later, after November 20th, they told you that the reason they couldn't find Javante was because he was underneath. But on November 20th, when y'all are on scene that day, all they told you was, we found Brandy and 2 children. They are deceased. Y'all said there should be a third child. And then later, after forensics and crime scene was gone, they said, we did find the third child. Everyone in the home is deceased.
Yes.
They never told you, you told us, how they died or where they were found.
No, ma'am. They never told us.
Did Henry Segura ever come to the crime scene?
No.
That's all.
Hey, Jerry, I have a question of this one. All right, you step in. Call you next week.
She calls Mark Lewis.
Yes, Your Honor. To the real, please.
Yes, Your Honor.
You remain under oath.
Yes, Your Honor.
Please state your name for the record.
Mark Lewis.
You may proceed.
When you interviewed the defendant, Henry Segura, on November 20th, did you tell him any details about how Brandy Peters died?
No.
What about the twin girls? Did you give him any details about how they died or where in the home they were found?
No.
At any point in that interview on November 20th, did the defendant ask you how the twins died?
He never did.
Did he ever ask you how Brandy Peters died?
He never did.
On November 20th, At the time that you interviewed the defendant, did you even know how these victims died?
No, I didn't.
Had their autopsies even been done yet on November 20th?
No, they weren't.
I guess they weren't even done till the following day, I believe, or the day after that?
That's correct.
Okay. Did law enforcement put out a press release about this case?
Yes,
And when was that done?
the following day, November 21st.
Okay, so November 21st would have been on Sunday, right?
Yes,
Okay, so the day after the bodies are discovered and the day after the first interview of the defendant.
that's correct.
All right. Did the press release give any details about how these victims were killed?
No,
Did it give any details about where in the house they were found?
no.
All right, why did you not include that information?
As much as law enforcement tries to be transparent, we also need to disclose pertinent information, so when we do have interviews or when people have information, they can fill in those pieces for
Okay.
us.
So you try to keep some pieces of information close to the chest that maybe only the murderer would know.
That's correct.
All right. And to not divulge details of an investigation like that, is that a policy for all of your department?
Yes,
To not give out any specific details of an investigation?
we do not give out specific details of open investigations.
Okay, thank you.
Rob?
Yes, sir.
You know who Pint is, right?
Sir,
You know who Pint is, correct?
I know her name, I don't know her.
Margarita Davis, right?
I believe Johnson, but
Johnson at the time, okay. Point is, you guys identified who that was.
yes,
As part of investigating and reconstructing Mr. Segura's day, you figured out who he would have seen and who he would have talked to that day, correct?
correct.
And she was one of the people y'all talked to at some point in the days and weeks following the murders, correct?
Yes,
Okay. And you said you didn't know the cause of death until after the autopsies were performed?
That's correct.
Right. But isn't it also true that Mr. Segura didn't know that? I mean, during your interview, didn't he tell you that he assumed all three kids were drowned because they were found in the bathtub?
no, he never told me that.
You don't recall that?
No, I don't.
Okay, no further questions.
Redirect.
You've watched and read the transcript of that November 20th interview several times, have you not, Investigator Lewis?
Yes,
Safe to say this is maybe the most important case you've had in your career because of through these three deceased children,
it is the most important case of my career.
okay? If he had ever told you in that November 20th interview that I've got the transcript for right here and that you've read several times that these children were drowned, found in the tub, anything like that, that would be reflected in there, that would be on the video that you watched, that would be in your memory, right?
Of course,
And he never asked how they died, and you never told them how they died, right?
that's correct.
He never asked where they were found, you never told them where they were found, right?
That's correct.
And what he said what he told you that he knew coming into that interview was that his hairdresser, Pint, told him that Brandy and the two girls, the twins, were found dead in the home, and that Javante was missing. And then when he arrived at Pint's house, that Pint then told him, I heard that they found Javante too, and he's dead.
That is correct.
Okay. And that's what is reflected in the transcript and that we see, what we saw in that video when you were on the stand the other day.
Yes, ma'am.
That's all.
Any juror have a question of this witness? You accept that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, witness?
Can I ask him one more question, Judge?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Did Henry Segura, I apologize, ever tell you that he was at Brandy's house on November 19th at any time for any reason?
He never told me that.
Okay. Okay. As the lead investigator in this case, if he had told that to any other officer, would there be a report about that?
Absolutely.
Would you have been informed about that?
I would have seen it.
Would that have been a pretty big deal since that was completely different than what he said in both his interviews?
That would have been huge.
All right, that's all.
On that subject.
Yes, sir. So you're saying that you all were in close communication, you were aware of the details, the important details relative to the case, correct?
Y'all, meaning who?
The homicide investigators.
We had cell phones, we could reach out to one another.
Right, and what you're saying to Ms. Dugan is that if something important, like Mr. Segura admitting to being at the scene on the day of the murders, if that had been conveyed to any of the investigators, that's something certainly that you would have known about as the lead investigator. You would have
Yes.
seen a report, heard about that.
Yes.
Isn't it true, Investigator Lewis, that as late as your deposition in 2016, you had no idea that DNA capable of being compared to known standards was found at the crime scene in this case?
Can you rephrase that question, sir?
In 2016, 5 years after Mr. Segura had been arrested on this offense, at that late date, you still didn't know that interpretable DNA was discovered at the crime scene. Over 200 exhibits submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement with mixtures and profiles, partial profiles. You didn't know that as late as 2016, isn't that true?
Yeah, I'm not a DNA guy, but I did not know that.
You don't think it's important that DNA is found at the scene that's capable of being compared to other people's profiles?
Argumentative.
I'm not familiar with the science of it. Oh, sorry, Judge. I'm not familiar with the science of it, sir, but I did not know that.
And while I understand you're not trained to interpret electrophorograms, you get a report from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that tells you what their findings are, correct?
Correct.
So there was one on December 3rd from Joe Ellen Brown. You would have had that?
If
What
it's
year are you talking about?
I'm sorry, 2011.
2000,
Or 2010, I'm sorry, 2010, December 3rd, 2010. That would have been your first report from Joe Ellen Brown, correct?
That doesn't make sense. November 3rd, 2000?
December 3rd.
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's December 3rd, 2010.
I don't have these reports in front of me, sir. We're talking 9 years ago, but all FDLE reports have been submitted.
Okay, so you would have reviewed FDLE's reports?
Yes.
Okay, and how was it that you didn't know as late as 2016 that interpretable DNA was located all over the place?
Sir, I'm not familiar with the science.
Okay, no further questions.
Redirect.
Yes, sir. In 2016, at that point, the defendant had been arrested for 5 years, right?
Yes.
And had not reached out to police at any point in that 5 years to try to speak to you or talk to you, give another interview, anything like that, right?
Correct.
I would
Okay.
object to questions about silence after arrest or not.
Sustained.
Request to hear the instruction.
Okay. And my point is,
Let
and,
me stop.
yes, sir. I apologize.
Slow down. Settle down, this, look, all right, sit down, please.
Okay.
All right. The objection is that it's not proper to hold against someone exercising their right to remain silent once they've been arrested. So that is an inappropriate question, and you should not consider that as evidence against the defendant. You may proceed, Ms. Dugan.
Thank you, I apologize. My point is that in 2016, at that point, the case had been with the state attorney's office for 5 years because he'd been arrested in 2011. At that point, it goes to the state attorney's office?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so it had been at the state attorney's office then for 5 years, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So at that point, you hadn't been involved in the case as far as anything involved with the defendant?
That's correct.
Okay. And so by 2016, any DNA evidence is going to be part of what the state attorney's office is doing at that point?
Yes.
Okay, that's all.
Any juror have a question at this point? Right, you step down.
Yes,
Right, next witness. You would face the clerk to be sworn, please, sir.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I swear.
Have a seat, right up the rail, please, sir.
Morning, sir.
Morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors? And my name is Jason Newlin, JASONNEWLIN.
And Mr. Newland, where do you work?
I'm an investigator with the State Attorney's Office here in Tallahassee.
Are you a sworn law enforcement officer?
I am.
How long have you been with the State Attorney's Office?
I've been with the State Attorney's Office almost 10 years now, creeping up on 17 years law enforcement total.
Where are your prior law enforcement experience?
Fish and Wildlife and McCullough County Sheriff's Office.
During the course of those years, have you had an occasion to be involved in investigations at the State Attorney's Office or preparation for cases for trial in your duties?
Yes.
What are your duties at the State Attorney's Office?
That's a good question. It varies. It's generally case follow-up investigation, interviews, anything the prosecutors ask, we try to accomplish.
Okay. One of those duties, following up on contact made by certain persons to the State Attorney's Office or follow-up leads or whatever it is, of homicide investigations or any other investigations for that matter as they become available after an arrest has been made.
Yes.
Okay. In the course of your duties, did you become involved as an investigator regarding State of Florida versus Henry Segura?
Yes, I did.
When did you become involved in that first time?
2010.
So you became involved in that even prior to the arrest?
Yes.
During the course of your involvement with the State of Florida versus Henry Segura, did you become familiar with a gentleman by the name of Santos?
I did.
At some point in this involvement, did Mr. Santos make a claim about Angel Avila being involved in the homicide?
It was around January of 2016 when he finally said that name.
Okay. So in January 2016, he first said the name Angel Avila.
Yes.
Had law enforcement, including yourself, had contact with Mr. Santos prior to that?
Yes, my first contact was in 2012.
Okay. Your first contact, did he mention any time at any point during that contact about Angel Avila's involvement in this homicide?
None whatsoever.
Fair to say that there's been numerous letters written by Mr. Santos to the State Attorney's Office and the court over those years?
Yes.
Prior to January 2016, did any of those letters, correspondence, or anything along the lines or interviews with Mr. Santos, did he mention Angel Avila being involved?
No.
Okay. Prior to that, was there a court proceeding in which Mr. Avila's name was mentioned?
There was.
When was that?
Court hearing was June 17th, 2015.
Okay. So that would have predated that by almost 18 months, his letter that first named Angel Avila.
No, by almost 6-7 months.
I'm sorry, 7 months, my bad. I can't add very well, so I'm a lawyer. Was that hearing covered by the media?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Was Mr. Avila's name in that? Was Mr. Avila's name mentioned in that media coverage?
Yes, it was.
Following that, did you interview Mr. Santos about Mr. Avila?
The following day.
Okay. Where was that located at?
Leon County Jail.
And as I understand it, defense counsel, yourself, and Investigator Lewis were present during that interview.
That's correct.
Okay. Did he say anything in that interview about Mr. Avila?
He had never heard of him and did not know who he was.
Okay. And did anybody show him a picture?
Yes, the defense counsel showed him one.
Okay. And did he recognize the person in that picture?
No, he did not.
Okay. So as I understand it, it wasn't until after the hearing and after your interview in which y'all discussed Mr. Avila that he first made the claim about Mr. Avila, correct?
Correct.
How was it how was it he made the claim first regarding Mr. Avila?
We were provided a sworn statement by the defense from Mr. Santos.
Okay. And that was when?
January of 2016.
Okay. And that was a typed statement or a written statement?
Typed.
Okay. Is that different than all the other correspondence that was given by Mr. Santos to both the court and
It's the only typed statement we've ever received from Santos.
Okay. Following that mention, did you locate Mr. Avila?
I did.
And where was he located at?
Trieste or Trieste, Italy. I don't know how to say the name.
Okay. And you talked to Mr. Avila?
Through a translator, I did, yes,
Okay. Why through a translator?
because he doesn't speak English at all.
At some point, did Mr. Santos make a claim about Demario Paramore involved in this homicide?
He did, late 2017.
Okay, and was that, how was that mention made?
I was following another court proceeding where Mr. Paramore's name was mentioned.
Okay, and was that in a letter or a type statement?
It was in a letter to the court, actually.
Okay, and when was that letter dated?
August 17th, 2017.
Okay. Prior to that August 17th, 2017, was there a court proceeding in which Mr. Paramore's name was mentioned?
Yes, there was.
When was that court proceeding?
It is a week or two prior to the letter being written. It was early August of 17.
Okay, and was that hearing covered by the media?
Yes, it was.
Okay, and was Mr. Paramore's named in the mention of that media coverage?
Yes.
So we've been following that media coverage that he mentioned Paramore for the first time.
Correct.
Okay. So both Angel Avila and Mr. Paramore, both of them mentioned by Mr. Santos, but both of those were first brought to the attention after court proceedings and or interviews in which those names were brought to him.
Correct.
Prior to that August 17, 2017 correspondence, had he made any claims about Demario Paramore at that point?
No.
And any of the correspondence that you received or interviews?
No.
Did you go and speak with Mr. Santos to inquire whether or not he spoke Spanish?
I did.
When was that?
Last week.
Okay. How'd you go about figuring that out?
We have an intern in our office that's Venezuelan and speaks Spanish. Took her out there, and I didn't say a word, let her communicate with him in Spanish, and he did not understand a single thing that was said to him.
No further questions.
Just want to clarify a couple of things. Angel Avila's full name is Angel Avila, or Quinones Avila Quinones.
Angel Antonio Avila Quinones.
Right, and so when, I guess it was 2015, when, I'm sorry? I guess it was 2015 when you and prior counsel, Mark Lewis, and the investigator for the defense at that time went out and interviewed him. He did say he knew Quinones, who was a drug trafficker who funneled his drugs through Atlanta, right?
He said he knew a Quinones that was a drug trafficker, yes.
And talked about him going through Atlanta?
Yeah, it's Atlanta to Texas or something.
Okay, thank you, no further questions.
Redirect.
And that interview occurred after the hearing and the media coverage, correct?
It was the following day, yes.
And Mr. Avila's full name was disclosed in the media coverage or not?
I don't recall the full name. I do know Antonio Avila Quinones has been said several times, yes.
Okay, so not the full thing, but you know the Quinones Avila name was published in that media coverage the day before?
Correct.
Okay. No further question.
Did you ever have a question of this witness? Step there. Next witness.
Yes, sir.
You would face the clerk to be sworn, please.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Let's see, sign it back up, please.
Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
Yes, my name is Patrick Sanford. I'm the special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Okay. And how long have you been with the FBI?
Approximately 20 years, a little over 20 years.
And do you have any other prior law enforcement experience?
Yes, I was a police officer in Montgomery, Alabama for approximately 5 years prior to that.
Not going to get into all your duties at the FBI because I'm sure some of it we may not be able to know, but at some point did you become involved in assisting the state attorney's office regarding the homicide where state of Florida versus Henry Segura?
Yes, I did.
And was that involvement to help locate an Angel Avila?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And did you locate an Angel Avila?
Yes, I did.
Where was he?
He was living in Trieste, Italy.
Okay. At some point, did you travel to Italy to get Mr. Avila's DNA?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Did you have to go to his home to do that?
No, I went to Rome, Italy, to where our United States Embassy is at, and he met me in Rome.
So he traveled from Trieste, Italy to Rome to meet with you?
Yes, he did.
So this wasn't a situation where you had to compel him or do a search warrant or something along those lines for it?
No, not at all.
He willingly provided that DNA sample?
Yes, he was very cooperative.
At some point, did you have to travel back to Italy?
Yes, I did.
Did you travel, when was that?
The first trip was in 2016, September, when I collected his DNA and fingerprints. And this time I just went back on, it was last week, I met with him on November the 8th.
Okay. And that was to assist in providing closed circuit testimony?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you meet with Avila then?
I did.
Okay. How tall is Mr. Avila?
He's a little bit shorter than me, probably 5'7", 5'8", somewhere around there.
Okay. How tall are you?
5'9", 5'10".
All right. So he's, I'm sorry, how tall did you say he was?
He was about 5'7", 5'8", at least an inch or two shorter than me.
What kind of build is he?
Average build, slightly on the little bit skinny side, but just normal build.
Would you classify him as a tall, skinny Colombian?
No, not at all.
This closed circuit testimony was in contact and communication you had with Mr. Avila. Did you have to use a translator to do so?
Yes, we did.
No further questions.
Rob? No problem. Step in.
Your Honor, this might be a good time to take a 10-minute or a morning break.
We're gonna do
Play video. Yes, sir.
All right, let's take 10 minutes. Palacios mentioned of Kennard, and there was another page I added which had the state's cross on it. Well, it's all very brief. Y'all discussed how you want to do that.
No, Your Honor, we had talked about doing that during lunch hour. This video should take us to the lunch hour, and we talked about trying to figure out how we can do that at lunch hour.
Okay, all right. Say if the video becomes too difficult just for that small segment, then do it the old-fashioned way. Just have you pick somebody to relate what was said. But we used to always do it, but now very seldom do it. But anyway, so, all right. We'll take 10 minutes.
jury, please.
Remain standing for the jurors.
Everybody be seated, please. So what you're going to hear next is perpetuated testimony of Angel Avila Quinones that was taken in Italy. I believe you should consider this as you would any other testimony. What we're going to do, we're going to take it up till about noon and break it off and come back to the end of it at the end of that.
Yes, Your Honor, we have, for the court's order, we've issued the transcripts to all those jurors.
All right? You may proceed.
Thank you. Please swear in the juror.
Yes. Yeah. I do.
Now, I'm going to ask you two gentlemen there to introduce yourself, please.
Le voy a solicitar a los dos caballeros que comparecen que se presenten.
I'm Special Agent Patrick Sanford with the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Soy el agente especial Patrick Sanford. Patrick Sanford con el jefe.
Mr. Avila, can you please introduce yourself?
Ávila,
Mi nombre es Ángel Antonio Ávila Quiñones. Soy el testigo en esta corte.
My name is Ángel Antonio Ávila Quiñones. I am the witness.
And Mr. Avila, can you please spell your first and last name for matter recorded?
Señor Ávila, si me puede deletrear, por favor, su nombre y apellido para la tarifa.
Mi nombre A-N-G-E-L Ángel. A-N-T-O-N-I-O Antonio. Mi apellido, el primero. A-V-I-L-A. El segundo apellido. Q-U-I-N-O-N-E-S.
First name, Angel, A-N-G-E-L, Antonio, A-N-T-O-N-I-O. First surname, Avila, A-V-I-L-A. Second surname, Quiñones, Q-U-I-N-O-N-E-S.
Mr. Sanford, where are y'all located?
We are located in Rome, Italy, in the United States Embassy.
Estamos ubicados en Roma, Italia, en la Embajada de los Estados Unidos.
Mr. Sanford, will you please swear in Mr. Avila?
Mr. Sanford, ¿puede juramentar al señor Avila?
Yes. Mr. Avila, please raise your right hand.
Juro.
Sir?
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
¿Jura o afirma decir la verdad, toda la verdad y nada más que la verdad?
Sí, juro.
Sir.
Thank you. And,
Gracias, puedo ganar.
Mr. Avila, where do you currently reside? Where do you live?
Señor Ávila, ¿en dónde vive usted hoy en día? ¿Dónde reside?
Está un poco bajo el volumen.
Señor Ávila, ¿en dónde vive hoy en día? ¿En dónde reside?
Yo vivo en la ciudad de Trieste, de Italia.
I live in the city of Trieste. ¿Cómo se llama? In Italy. The interpreter is going to request repetition of the name of the city. Not quite clear. ¿Cómo se llama la ciudad?
Trieste. Trieste.
Trieste.
Please spell that.
Si lo puede deletrear, por favor.
T-R-I-E-S-T.
T-R-I-E-S-T-E.
And how long have you lived in Italy?
¿Cuánto tiempo ha vivido usted en Italia?
Yo llegué a Italia el 16 de marzo del 2010.
I arrived in Italy March 16, 2010.
Yo soy colombiano.
Colombian.
And is that where you resided prior to moving to Italy?
Allá estuve viviendo antes de vivir en Italia.
Sí, en Colombia viví.
I used to live in Colombia.
Mr. Avila, are you married?
Señor Ávila, ¿usted está casado?
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
How long have you been married?
¿Cuánto tiempo lleva usted casado?
Yo me casé el 19 de agosto del 2009.
I was married on August 19th of 2009.
And Mr. Avila, you were there at the U.S. Embassy in Rome, correct?
Señor Ávila, usted en ese momento está presente en la embajada de los Estados Unidos en Roma, ¿correcto?
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
And are you there, how did you get there?
¿Cómo llegó allá?
Llegué aquí porque me enviaron desde Estados Unidos los pasajes por tren y también me pagaron el hotel.
I got here because I was sent the train tickets from the United States, they paid my tickets and also the train.
So you took a train to Rome from your home?
¿Usted tomó el tren de su casa a Roma?
Sí, desde mi casa a Roma. Sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
And are you there talking to us willingly on your own accord?
¿Usted está presente allá hablando con nosotros voluntariamente? ¿Por qué voluntario?
No entendí.
I didn't understand.
Are you there talking to us because you want to be?
Usted está allá presente hablando con nosotros en este momento. ¿Quiere usted estar hablando con nosotros?
Es que no le escucho bien, como muy bajo el volumen.
Here, the volume is very low. Maybe I'll speak louder. Is this where the...
No,
the mic? Gotcha. Okay. ¿Me escucha mejor?
Sí, sí, señor.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you please repeat the question?
Are you there at the U.S. Embassy because you want to be there?
¿Usted está presente en la embajada allá de los Estados Unidos porque quiere estar presente?
Sí, lo hago por mi propia voluntad, sí.
Yes, I'm doing it out of my own free will.
Now, Mr. Avila, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about your history in the United States.
Señor Ávila, voy a hablar con usted un poco acerca de su historial acá en los Estados Unidos.
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
Were you previously prosecuted in Florida for trafficking in narcotics?
¿Usted previamente lo habían procesado acá en la Florida por tráfico de narcóticos?
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
Did you ever try and bring those narcotics into Florida?
¿Usted en algún momento trató de ingresar esos narcóticos acá a la Florida?
No, señor.
No, sir.
Did you ever try and bring any narcotics into the United States?
¿En algún momento intentó usted ingresar narcóticos a los Estados Unidos?
No, señor.
No, sir.
So, where were you arrested then for the charges that you were prosecuted for?
Entonces, ¿en dónde lo arrestaron a usted por los cargos por los cuales lo están procesando?
Yo estaba a 450 millas afuera de Acapulco, México.
I was 450 miles out to sea from Acapulco, Mexico.
Okay. I assume that means you were on a boat.
Me imagino que eso significa que usted estaba sobre un barco o a bordo de un barco.
Sí, yo era el capitán de aquel barco.
Yes, I was the captain of said boat.
When you were arrested, were there narcotics on that boat?
Cuando ustedes lo arrestaron, ¿habían narcóticos sobre el barco o a bordo del barco?
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
Where was it that you were bringing the narcotics from?
¿De dónde traía usted los narcóticos?
Yo abordé este barco a 300 millas afuera del Perú.
I boarded that boat 300 miles outside of Peru.
So as I understand it, you boarded a boat 300 miles off of Peru and were arrested 450 miles off of Acapulco.
Según lo que entiendo, entonces usted abordó el barco a 300 millas de distancia del Perú y después lo arrestaron a 450 millas de Acapulco.
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
Where were you going if you had not been arrested?
¿A dónde se dirigía usted si no lo hubieran arrestado?
Debía hacer el contacto con el barco mexicano a 300 millas fuera de Acapulco.
I was supposed to make contact with the Mexican boat 300 miles outside of Acapulco.
So the plan was then to take the narcotics from 300 miles off of Peru to meet another boat 300 miles off the coast of Mexico.
Entonces el plan era llevar los narcóticos de 300 millas de distancia del Perú a 300 millas de distancia de Acapulco, México.
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
Prior to your arrest, had you ever done that trip before?
Antes de su arresto, ¿usted previamente había llevado a cabo ese viaje?
Sí, sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
How many times?
¿Cuántas veces?
Sí, hice 7 veces con droga y 1 sin droga.
I made 7 trips with drugs and 1 trip without drugs.
Were they all the same, where they were 300 miles from Peru to 300 miles off of Mexico?
¿Eran todos iguales, de 300 millas a distancia del Perú a 300 millas de distancia de Acapulco?
Sí, esa era la posición que siempre usaban.
Yes, that was the position we always used.
At any point during any of those trips, did you ever try and bring narcotics into the United States?
¿En algún momento durante alguno de esos viajes trató de ingresar usted narcóticos a los Estados Unidos?
Nunca.
Never.
At any point prior to your arrest, had you ever been to the United States in any way, shape, or form?
¿En algún momento antes de su arresto usted había estado en los Estados Unidos de alguna manera?
La primera vez fue el 31 de octubre del 98.
The first time was on October 31st of 1998.
And was that your arrest?
¿Ese fue su arresto?
No, fue mi primer viaje que hacía que naufragamos. No llegamos, ese viaje se perdió. No se pegó la droga.
No, that was the first trip that failed. We capsized and the drugs were not delivered.
Okay. How did you end up in the United States on that trip?
En ese viaje, ¿cómo es que resultó usted en los Estados Unidos?
Después del naufragio nos rescató un barco de bandera israelí.
After the capsizing, we were rescued by a ship, an Israeli flag ship, or boat with an Israeli flag.
And then how did you get to the United States then?
Entonces, ¿cómo llegó a los Estados Unidos?
El barco venía de Nueva York, según me dijo el capitán, y atravesaron el canal de Panamá para dirigirse hasta Long Beach, California.
The boat, according to the captain, had left from New York, was crossing the Panama Canal, and was headed to Long Beach, California.
So the boat took you to California?
Entonces el barco lo llevó a California.
Sí, hasta Long Beach, California.
Yes, to Long Beach, California.
What happened when you arrived in California?
¿Qué pasó cuando llegó usted?
Nos fue a recibir emigración de Estados Unidos y el vicecónsul de la embajada colombiana.
We were received by immigration in the United States, as well as the vice consul in Colombia.
And did you remain in the United States?
¿Usted permaneció en los Estados Unidos?
Solo un día. Llegamos a las 6 de la mañana y salimos a las 5 de la tarde de Estados Unidos.
Only one day. We arrived at 6 in the morning and left at 5 in the afternoon in the United States.
Where did you go at that point?
¿A dónde se fue en ese momento?
Estuvimos en el consulado colombiano en Los Ángeles.
We We were at the Colombian consulate in Los Angeles.
And did you stay in the United States, or did you return back to Colombia that day?
Ese día usted permaneció en los Estados Unidos y regresó a Colombia.
Ese mismo día regresamos a Colombia.
Same day we returned to Colombia.
Going back to your arrest, when was that?
Regresando a lo de su arresto, ¿cuándo fue?
El día de mi arresto,
The day of my arrest?
Yes.
Sí.
16 de febrero del año 2000.
February 16th of 2000.
Why were you transporting the narcotics from Peru to Mexico?
¿Por qué estaba transportando usted los narcóticos de Perú a México?
Yo me sentía, o sea, tuve una situación bastante difícil cuando comencé estos viajes.
I had a very difficult situation. I was in a very difficult situation when I started making these trips.
Were you asked to make these trips by other persons, or did you do it on your own?
¿Usted le solicitaron a otras personas que llevaran a cabo estos viajes o usted lo hizo por su propia voluntad?
El primer viaje fue una persona de Barranquilla.
First trip was for some people from Barranquilla.
Okay. What is that?
Es Barranquilla.
Barranquilla es una ciudad de Colombia.
Barranquilla is a city in Colombia.
What about the next 6 trips?
Los 6 viajes siguientes
Fueron con mi jefe Pedro Navarrete. Era
it was with my boss, Navarrete, I believe, in particular would like to say, the name is Pedro Navarrete, would like clarification. ¿Cuál era el nombre del jefe?
Pedro Navarrete.
That's correct, Pedro Navarrete.
Were you paid to do these runs?
¿Usted le pagaban por esos viajes?
Si a mí me ofrecieron, cuando él me contrató, pagarme $60,000 por cada viaje.
Yes, he offered me $60,000 to, when I started working with him, he offered me $60,000 for each trip.
Prior to starting and prior to the first trip, had you been approached about doing the same kind of thing previously?
Antes del primer viaje, ¿a usted le habían hablado de hacer lo mismo?
En el primer viaje, un año antes de salir, me ofrecieron ese viaje.
1 year before the first trip, I was offered to make that first trip.
And did you decline that?
¿Usted lo rechazó?
No, esa era en espera. Me decían que ya salía, que lo esperara y después de un año fue que salió el viaje.
No, it was just having to wait. They would tell me it was about to leave, just wait. And I have to wait for a year.
At some point, were you approached about making or doing some sort of transport of narcotics, and you declined to help them?
¿En algún momento le solicitaron a usted que transportaran narcóticos y usted se rehusó?
En el año 90 me hicieron una oferta, pero yo dije que no me servía porque la pesca, con lo que me ganaba en la pesca, me bastaba.
I was offered to do a trip in 1990, but I rejected it because the amount of money I was making in fishing was enough.
So you were a fisherman by trade?
Entonces, pescador por profesión.
Yo comencé en la pesca en el año 78.
I began fishing in 1978.
Why
why did you eventually decide to help them in 1998 when you declined them previously in 1990?
¿Usted por qué decidió ayudarlos en el 98 cuando anteriormente en el 90 los había rechazado?
Porque en Colombia no se hacía veda de pesca, o sea, los barcos no paraban, había mucha producción. Y cuando empezó a bajar la producción, todo fue un caos.
Because in Colombia, there wasn't a shortage of fish production. The boats were always running, but then once production dropped, it became chaotic.
And then I believe you said that you were in a situation in which you did not have any money.
Y también creo que usted mencionó que estuvo en una situación en la cual no tenía dinero.
Sí, porque los barcos salían a pescar y no traían nada de producción.
Yes, because the boats would go out to fish and would come back with nothing produced.
So essentially, you had to do this in order to earn money to feed your family.
Entonces, esencialmente, usted tuvo que hacer esto para poder ganarse un dinero para alimentar a su familia.
Sí, tenía 2 hijas que iban a la universidad y no tenía dinero para darle el estudio.
Yes, I had 2 daughters that were going to college, and I didn't have the money to pay for the studies.
So on February 16, 2000, you were arrested.
Se lo arrestaron el 16 de febrero del 2000.
No, ¿me repita la pregunta?
Se lo arrestaron el 16 de febrero del año 2000.
Sí, sí, señor.
Yes, yes, sir.
Who were you arrested by?
¿A quién lo arrestó usted? ¿O por quién fue arrestado?
Un barco de la Armada de los Estados Unidos.
Navy ship from the United States, or a military ship from the United States?
When they arrested you, did they take you immediately to the United States?
Cuando lo arrestaron, lo llevaron inmediatamente a los Estados Unidos.
El barco nos llevó hasta Panamá y de ahí cambiaron con otro barco de la Armada de los Estados Unidos y ese nos llevó hasta el puerto San Petersburgo, Tampa, Florida.
We met another U.S. military ship that then transported us over to St. Petersburg, Florida.
Were you in custody that entire time?
¿Estuvo usted bajo custodia todo ese tiempo?
Desde el día que nos arrestaron.
From the day we were arrested.
And is the Tampa where you eventually had a trial and ultimately a conviction for these crimes?
En Tampa fue donde usted en últimas tuvo un juicio y lo condenaron por esos delitos.
Sí, señor.
Yes, sir.
At any point during that time frame, were you out of custody?
¿En algún momento durante ese periodo de tiempo usted estuvo fuera de custodia?
No, siempre estuve en custodia.
No, I was always under custody.
When did you leave the United States?
¿Cuándo se fue usted? ¿Cuándo salió de los Estados Unidos?
El 8 de abril del 2009.
April 8th, 2009.
At any time between your arrest on February 16, 2000, and you leaving the United States on April 8, 2009, were you out of custody?
En algún momento, dentro del periodo de su arresto, del 16 de febrero del 2000 hasta que salió usted del país en el 8 de abril del 2009, ¿estuvo usted por fuera de custodia?
Nunca, jamás.
Never, never, ever.
What was your original sentence after your conviction?
¿Cuál fue su sentencia original después de que lo condenaron?
30 años.
30 years.
Why were you able to leave in 2009 would be shorter than 30 years?
¿Por qué logró salir usted en el 2009 que es menos de esos 30 años?
A mí me llamaron a la corte el 26, bueno, el 26 porque me llamaron en prisión, 26 de septiembre del 2008.
I was called, I received a call at the prison on September 26, 2008.
A call for what?
¿Una llamada para qué?
Me llamaron en prisión y cuando fui a R&D, que es la oficina de la prisión,
And I got a call at the prison, and I went to R&D, which is the office of the prison.
Okay. And was that call about possibly testifying in a trial against someone?
Y esa llamada fue para que posiblemente atestiguara en un juicio en contra de alguien más.
solo me dijeron que debía ir a la corte.
They just told me that I should go to court, that I should go to court.
And did you go to court?
¿Y usted fue a la corte?
Sí, el 30 salí de prisión, el 30 de septiembre.
Yes, I left prison September 30th.
When you left prison, were you in custody still?
Cuando usted salió de la prisión, ¿usted seguía bajo custodia?
Sí, bajo custodia.
Yes, I continue to be under custody.
And did you actually give testimony in a court proceeding?
¿Y usted dio testimonio en un procedimiento, en una corte, en un tribunal?
El 9 de octubre me presenté, primeramente, excuse.
October 9th, I made an appearance, but excuse me.
El 6 de octubre me visitó un fiscal.
I got a visit prosecutor on October 6th
En Tampa.
in Tampa.
Okay. And you made a court appearance?
¿Y usted hizo una comparecencia en el tribunal?
El fiscal fue que me dijo que me habían llamado, que me hizo una pregunta si yo sabía para qué me habían llamado. Le dije que yo no sabía.
The prosecutor asked if I knew why they had called me, and I told him I did not know.
But at some point, were you asked to give testimony about you transporting the narcotics back and forth from Peru to Mexico?
Pero en algún momento le preguntaron acerca de sus transportes de narcóticos de Perú a México.
Sí, cuando me presenté en la corte, me preguntaron de todos los viajes que yo había hecho.
Yes, when I showed up in court, they asked me about all the trips I had made.
And did you tell them?
¿Y usted les dijo?
Lo mismo que les estoy diciendo a ustedes, se lo dije a ellos.
The same things I'm telling you right now is what I told them.
Okay. Following your testimony, did you return to prison?
Después de su testimonio, ¿usted regresó a la prisión?
Sí, yo regresé el 2 de diciembre, regresé a la prisión.
Yes, I returned to prison on December 2nd.
When did you leave the United States?
¿Cuándo se fue usted de los Estados Unidos?
El 8 de abril del 2009.
April 8th, 2009.
And was your sentence, is that because your sentence was reduced because of your testimony?
Y esa raíz de que le redujeron la sentencia gracias a su testimonio.
Sí, el 9 de febrero del 2009 recibí la carta del juez donde me cambió la sentencia de 360 meses a 120 meses.
Yes, I received a letter from the judge on February 9th, 2009, indicating that he had changed my sentence from 360 months to 120 months.
Following your conclusion of your sentence, were you deported from the United States?
Después, en la conclusión, o después de que terminó su sentencia, ¿fue deportado usted a los Estados Unidos?
No, jamás. Yo no puedo entrar a los Estados Unidos. Nunca.
Never, I can never enter the United States.
Okay. But you were taken out of, or you left the United States, correct?
Pero usted se fue de los Estados Unidos, usted salió de los Estados Unidos, ¿correcto?
Yo salí el 8 de abril de los Estados Unidos.
Because I left the United States on April 8th.
Of 2009, correct?
Del 2009, ¿correcto?
Del 2009, sí, correcto.
2009, yes, correct.
Were you taken to the airport by law enforcement or by the United States government and put on a plane?
Lo llevaron al aeropuerto, o fue transportado al aeropuerto por las agencias del orden público o por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos y lo montaron a un avión.
A mí me recogieron en Audeo, Luisiana, y me llevaron a Houston, 2 agentes federales.
I was picked up in Louisiana and I was taken to Houston by 2 federal agents. And the interpreter indicated that gave the name of the city in Louisiana, but he could not understand.
What was the name of the city in Louisiana?
¿Cuál era el nombre de la ciudad en Louisiana?
Oakdale, Luisiana, era la prisión.
Oakdale?
Sí, Oakdale, Luisiana.
Oakdale, Louisiana was where the prison was located.
Okay. So you were taken from the prison to Houston, the airport in Houston, by federal marshal.
Entonces usted lo llevaron de la prisión hasta Houston, alguaciles federales.
A una prisión de migración, después de haberme comprado el pasaje, me lo compraron los federales, los agentes federales.
To an immigration detention facility after they had given me my airplane ticket. The airplane ticket was purchased for me by the federal agents.
And then they put you on the plane, correct?
Y ellos fueron los que lo montaron, usted al avión, ¿correcto?
Ellos mismos me montaron al avión.
They put me on the airplane.
Where did that airplane go?
Ese avión, ¿hacia dónde se dirigió?
Salió de Houston, hizo escala en México y luego a Bogotá. El mismo avión aterrizó en Bogotá, la capital de Colombia.
The airplane left Houston, made a stop in Mexico, and landed in Bogotá, Colombia's capital, Bogotá.
And is that where you got off the plane?
Ahí fue donde desembarcó usted del avión.
Sí, ahí me recibió la inmigración de Colombia.
Yes, I was received by Colombian immigration authorities.
At any point from your arrest in February 16th of 2000 until you got on that plane and arrived in Bogota, Colombia on April the 8th of 2009, were you ever out of custody?
En algún momento entre su arresto, el 16 de febrero del año 2000, hasta cuando usted aterrizó en Colombia, el 8 de abril del 2009, ¿estuvo usted por fuera de custodia?
Sí, después cuando llegué a Colombia, yo ya no estuve más en custodia, estuve libre.
Once I arrived in Colombia, I was no longer in custody, I was free.
But until you arrived in Colombia, from the time of your arrest until you arrived in Colombia, you were in custody.
Sí, correcto, pero desde el momento de su arresto hasta el momento en que usted llegó a Colombia, usted estuvo bajo custodia todo el tiempo.
Ah, sí, bajo custodia, hasta el momento que desembarqué el avión, que llegué a Colombia, ahí me recibió Emigración de Colombia para controlar, para ver si yo tenía casos pendientes con la ley, con la justicia colombiana.
Oh yes, I was in custody the whole time until I arrived in Colombia and I was received by the immigration authorities over there who wanted to verify that I didn't have any pending legal processes within Colombia.
And did you have any pending legal processes in Colombia?
¿Tuvo usted algún proceso legal pendiente en Colombia?
No, yo no tengo, estoy a paz y salvo con la justicia de Colombia, no tengo nada pendiente.
No, I am free and clear of any obligations to the justice system in Colombia. I don't have any pending processes.
And did you remain, and once you became free in Colombia, you stay in Colombia?
Una vez lo liberaron en Colombia, ¿usted permaneció en Colombia?
Hasta el 15 de marzo del 2010 que salí para Italia.
Until March 15th of 2010 when I left for Italy.
When you moved to Italy in March of 2010, have you remained in Italy since then?
Desde que se mudó usted a Italia en marzo del 2010, ¿usted ha permanecido en Italia?
Salí en el 2013, regresé a Colombia el 8 de abril del 2013.
I returned to Colombia on April 8th of 2013.
So in November of 2010, you were a resident of Italy.
Entonces, para el mes de noviembre del 2010, usted era residente de Italia.
Sí, y en ese tiempo estudiaba.
Yes, at that time I was studying.
What were you studying?
¿Qué estaba estudiando?
La lengua italiana.
Italian language.
When you returned to Colombia in April of 2013, how long did you remain there?
Cuando usted regresó a Colombia en abril del 2013, ¿cuánto tiempo permaneció?
11 meses.
11 months.
After 11 months, where did you go then?
Después de esos 11 meses, ¿a dónde fue?
Regresé otra vez a Italia para renovar documentos.
I returned once again to Italy to renew my documents.
You're talking about, you mean your immigration documents?
¿Se refiere a sus documentos de inmigración?
De residencia italiana.
Italian residence.
And have you remained a resident of Italy since that time?
¿Ha permanecido como residente de Italia desde ese entonces?
Sí, desde ese entonces. El año pasado fui a Colombia, Perú, por un mes a visitar a la familia.
Yes, last year I went to Colombia for 1 month to visit my family.
What do you do for a living?
¿A qué se dedica?
Yo trabajo con una cooperativa de trabajo que se llama Work Service.
I work for a work cooperative called Work Service.
And how long have you been working there?
¿Cuánto tiempo lleva trabajando allá?
Desde el 2 de julio del 2014.
Since July 2nd of 2014.
I'm going to show you a couple of documents.
Vamos a mostrarnos un par de documentos.
I'm showing you what's been previously marked as State's Exhibit 148.
Le voy a mostrar lo que ha sido marcado como la prueba instrumental de la Fiscalía número 148.
Okay. Mr. Avila, do you recognize this document?
Señor Ávila, ¿reconoce usted este documento?
Es un diploma de la lengua italiana en la escuela donde yo estudiaba.
It's a diploma for the Italian language from the school that I was studying at.
And when was that diploma issued?
¿Cuándo le otorgaron este diploma?
Yo terminé el 7 de febrero del 2011, terminé el curso.
I finished the course on February 7th of 2011. 2011?
El 7 de febrero del 2011.
2011. February 7th, 2011.
When were you enrolled in that class?
¿Cuándo se registró usted en esa clase?
El 6 de mayo del el primer curso, pero el 6 de mayo comenzamos el primer nivel y terminamos el 6 de mayo del 2010 y terminamos el 7 de febrero del 2011.
The first course started on May 6th of 2010. That was the first level course. And it ended in second one ended in February 7th, 2011.
I'm showing you the second page of that document, basically the number 148.
Le voy a mostrar la segunda página de este documento que es la correspondiente a la Fiscalía número 148.
What is this?
¿Qué es esto?
Creo que no se ve bien, pero creo que esa es la declaración del director de la escuela cuando fui a pedir en el periodo de octubre, finales de octubre y principio de noviembre, qué hacía. Entonces, ahí este nivel, el último nivel lo comenzamos el 14 de octubre del 2010 y terminamos el 7 de febrero del 2011.
I can't read it very clearly, but it seems to be a statement from the director of the institution. When I asked him what I should do between October and October and November. The second course started on October 14th of 2010 and ended on February 7th of 2011.
I'm showing some previously marked for identification purposes the state exhibit number 149.
Le estoy mostrando lo que ha sido marcado previamente como la prueba instrumental de la Fiscalía número 149.
What is this?
¿Qué es esto?
Pues no lo veo bien, no se ve bien en la pantalla, pero son el otro diploma, o sea, que fueron dos diplomas que me dieron, el primer nivel y el segundo nivel.
I can't read the screen very clearly, but it seems to be the second diploma, because I got two diplomas. I got a diploma for level 1 and one for level 2.
Try further. Can you read that any better?
¿Puedo acercarme un poco más a la pantalla?
Get closer to the screen.
Yeah.
Sí, se puede.
¿Sí puedo acercarme?
Yes. Can I come closer?
Sí.
Sí.
No se ve bien. No sé. Acabo.
It appears to be a diploma.
Pero parece ser un diploma.
Es un diploma y este es el nombre de la escuela, ALS.
Yes, it's a diploma, and this is the name of the school right here, ALS.
You mark the state exhibit number 150.
Les estoy mostrando lo que ha sido previamente marcado con la prueba instrumental de la Fiscalía número 150, 150.
You recognize what these are?
¿Reconoce qué es esto?
Estos son los recibos de la agencia de arrendamiento donde mi esposa era la que tenía el contrato, pero yo era el que iba a pagar cada mes.
Those are the payment receipts for the rental property. That was under my wife's name, but I was the one that made the payments every month.
And are these from October and November of 2010?
Estos son de octubre y noviembre de 2010.
Los dos últimos meses que se pagaba, el 5 de cada mes pagaba yo el arrendo.
The last 2 months, I made payments, rent payments, the 5th day of every month.
Finally, this is exhibit number 151. You can see this. You recognize what this is?
Y el último, prueba instrumental de la Fiscalía número 151. ¿Puede ver este documento? ¿Lo reconoce?
Sí, lo reconozco. Este fue la declaración de la propietaria de esta agencia de arrendamiento.
Yes, I do recognize it. That's a statement from the owner of the rental agency.
It indicates that you paid rent in October and November of 2010.
Y Y ese documento indica que usted pagó la renta en octubre y noviembre del 2010.
Sí, esta es la declaración que en este periodo yo fui a pagar el arrendo.
Yes, that is her statement, indicating that during that period of time I went to pay the rent.
Mr. Avila, do you know someone in the United States by the name of Carlos Santos?
Señor Ávila, ¿usted conoce a alguien en los Estados Unidos llamado Carlos Santos?
No conozco ese nombre.
I do not know that name.
Do you know anybody by the name of Otis Jackson?
¿Usted conoce a alguna persona conocida Otis Jackson?
Tampoco conozco a esa persona con ese nombre.
I also do not know that person by that name.
How about Hayward Griffin?
¿Qué tal un tal Hayward Griffin?
Para mí son desconocidos.
To me, he is an unknown individual.
Demario Paramore?
¿Qué tal Demario Paramore?
No lo conozco.
I do not know him.
Brandy Peters?
Brandy Peters?
Tampoco lo conozco.
I also do not know him.
Mr. Avila, after you got on the plane in Houston and sent back to Colombia in April of 2009, have you ever returned to the United States?
Desde que usted señor Ávila, desde que usted se montó al avión en Houston y regresó a Colombia en abril del 2009, ¿usted ha regresado en algún momento a los Estados Unidos?
Nunca he regresado a los Estados Unidos.
I've never returned to the United States.
Have you ever been to the United States when you were not in the custody of law enforcement?
¿En algún momento usted estaba bajo los Estados Unidos? ¿En algún momento que no haya estado bajo custodia de las agencias del orden público?
No, yo no conozco Estados Unidos. Las calles de Estados Unidos no las conozco.
No, I do not know the United States. I do not know streets of the United States.
Do you even know where Tallahassee, Florida is?
¿Usted siquiera sabe en dónde queda Tallahassee, Florida?
Escuché que era la capital de la Florida, del estado de la Florida, pero no conozco.
I have heard that it is the capital of the state of Florida, but I do not know that place.
Mr. Avila, back in November 19th of 2010, did you travel to Tallahassee, Florida to commit murders against Brandy Peters, Amaya Peters, Anaya Peters, and Javante Segura?
Señor Ávila, ¿usted viajó a los Estados Unidos para cometer el asesinato, o viajó a los Estados Unidos el 19 de noviembre del 2010 para cometer los asesinatos de Brandy Peters, Tamaya Peters, Tanaya Peters,
and Javante Segura?
y Javante Segura?
No, señor.
No, sir. Un momento.
I have no further questions at this time.
Tengo más preguntas en este momento.
Your Honor, if I can, I have the documents here. They were mislabeled on that. I had previously referred to them as State Exhibit number 158. That has actually been now renamed State Exhibit number 155. State Exhibit number 149, it properly should be 156. State Exhibit number 150 is now properly 157. And State's Exhibit number, referred to as 151, is now State's Exhibit number 158. And at this time, I'd move these into evidence, please, Your Honor.
Is there objection? No. Could be admitted?
And Your Honor, can I publish them very quickly?
No, it's not a big one.
Okay.
All right, let's take a lunch break. We'll see you back, let's start back at 1:30.